The Medusa Reader, edited by Marjorie Garber and Nancy J. Vickers. The Medusa Reader began in the summer of 1986 when the two of us discovered a common strain in our research. Each of us had written an essay on Shakespeare, the one on Macbeth and the other on Lycoris, that had almost inadvertently drawn us to Medusa. Both had been attracted by the wealth and range of provocative interpretation inspired by Medusa's deeply enigmatic story. Striking too was the regularity with which a figure more than a millennium in the making, to cite an advertisement for 1999's hottest scream machine, a roller coaster named Medusa, returned within the high and low cultural production of our contemporaries. The net of our collaboration expanded to include generous colleagues as well as a team of enthusiastic undergraduate and graduate research assistants. Toby Casper unearthed texts and produced an invaluable bibliography. Paul Franklin found countless images, both canonical and non-canonical. Lois Levine in Los Angeles and Karen Paik and Mindy Smart in Cambridge drafted headnotes, pursued permissions, located further images, added bibliographical references, and kept track of myriad crucial details. This anthology would have been unimaginable without them. Leslie Lundeen, Valerie Jaffe, Nish Saran, and Brina Milikowski contributed additional headnotes and assistance at key moments. Marcy Bianco, Nell Booth, and Nina Vergeri helped us achieve closure. Our institutions, Bryn Mawr College, Harvard University, and the University of Southern California, provided critical financial support. William Germano, our editor at Routledge, has been alternately persistent and patient. Both qualities are deeply appreciated. Our hope is that the volume serves scholars who will find these texts usefully assembled and profit from a wealth of bibliography, students who will learn here how myth generates meaning over time, and general readers who will find short and compelling selections and images in these pages to seduce and astonish the imagination. Marjorie Garber and Nancy J. Vickers. Introduction. Poets have called her a muse. Feminists have adopted her as a sign of powerful womanhood. Anthropologists read her image as embedded in the paradoxical logic of amulets, talismans, and relics. Psychoanalysts have understood the serpents wreathing her head as a symbol of the fear of castration. Political theorists have cast her as a figure for revolt. Artists have painted her in moods from sublime to horrific. The most canonical writers, Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, Goethe, Shelley, have invoked her story and sung both her praise and her blame. The most adventurous of postmodern designers and performers see her as a model, a logo, and a figure for the present age. Petrifying. Astonishing. Monumental. All these words, which have at their core the idea of being turned into stone, are central to the figure of Medusa. From its distant beginnings, the story of Medusa has fascinated listeners and readers and terrified them. For what is most compelling in the long history of the myth and its retellings is Medusa's intrinsic doubleness, at once monster and beauty, disease and cure, threat and protection, poison and remedy. The woman with snaky locks who could turn the unwary onlooker to stone has come to stand for all that is obdurate and irresistible. Although the original Medusa was said to be a beauty, Medusa in common parlance came to mean monster. The tension between the beautiful Medusa and the monstrous one is intrinsic to the story, to the figure of Medusa herself, and to the twin strands of feminism and misogyny that have attached themselves to retellings of the Medusa myth throughout the ages. Who is Medusa, and how can we account for her persistent fascination? Ancient sources differ on some details, as will be clear from the selections included in this volume, but the gist of the story is this. The exquisitely beautiful Medusa, one of the three Gorgons of Greek myth and the only mortal one, was said to have dallied with or, in other versions, to have been raped by the sea god Poseidon in the temple of Athena. As punishment for this transgression, Athena transformed Medusa from woman to monster, changing her luxuriant long hair into a tangle of hissing snakes. A spectator gazing at Medusa would henceforth be turned to stone. One of the tasks of the hero Perseus, son of Zeus and the mortal Danae, was to slay Medusa, a task he was able to perform with the help and advice of the gods. Warned not to look directly at her, he gazed instead at her reflection in his shield and, guided by her mirrored image, cut off her head. The two children of the union of Medusa and Poseidon sprang to life at the instant of their mother's decapitation. One of these was Chrysaor, later the father of the monster Geryon, and the other was Pegasus, later the winged horse of the Muses, hence the persistent association of Medusa with poetry and the arts. Perseus next appropriated Medusa's head as a device for his own protection, holding it up to petrify his enemies. On one occasion he punished the inhospitality of the giant Atlas by showing him the Medusa head. Atlas was transformed into a mountain, whose rocky bulk held up the heavens. On another occasion, that of his own wedding to Andromeda, Perseus produced the head of Medusa to vanquish a rival suitor and his partisans. The rival was turned to stone. Ultimately, Perseus gave Medusa's head to his patroness Athena, the very goddess who had caused Medusa's monstrosity. Athena wore it thereafter in the center of her aegis and used it to subdue her foes. Thus the head of Medusa, initially figuring rebellion, competition, and sexual desirability, becomes, under Athena's sign, transformed into a beneficial emblem and a source of civic and martial strength. Indeed, Athena, by some accounts, invented the art of weaponry. She was regarded as the goddess of heralds. The first and most ancient of armorial signs is the head of the Medusa, often emblazoned on a proud warrior's breastplate as well as on his shield. Medusa's head thus becomes apotropaic, literally warding off or turning away the evils it embodies. Terror is used to drive out terror, so that the formerly stupefying image is turned back upon one's enemies. Both trope, a turn of phrase, a figure of speech, and apotrope, a warning, the head of Medusa partakes of linguistic as well as material culture, and has over time been seen as the epitome of the apotropaic object. As we shall see, by the later 20th century the double potential of the apotrope will inform representations of Medusa in popular culture as well as in high art. The same combination of danger, power, and beauty that led Athena to adopt the Medusa head as her emblem has rendered the head an evocative sign and a literal logo for advertising, music video, and visual culture today. The story of Medusa is told by such classical authors as Hesiod, Apollodorus, Ovid, and Lucan. Later imitated and appropriated by the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, Medusa becomes a figure for a remarkable series of public virtues and private terrors: eloquence, fame and admiration, stupor, erotic temptation, and the confusion of genders. This allegorized Medusa appears in authors ranging from Dante, Boccaccio, and Christine de Pizan to Shakespeare and Francis Bacon. The myth, moreover, is interpreted not only in literature and political theory but also in painting and sculpture. The celebrated Caravaggio Medusa, painted on a round shield and reproduced on the cover of this volume, inspired Louis Marin's 1977 meditation on the nature of representation. A portrait by Leonardo da Vinci provides a provocative occasion for Freud to speculate on Oedipal conflict. Cellini's monumental statue of Perseus displaying Medusa's head victor and vanquished uncannily twinned in expression offers ground for political, Neil Hertz, and anthropological, Tobin Siebers, reflection. Some etymologies of the word Medusa derive it from the Greek for ruler or queen, and Medusa has long been associated by commentators with female rulers and also with the Amazons. But Medusa has many political roles. Hertz, for example, analyzes the ways in which the French Revolution was also depicted in the figure of Medusa, seen in words and images of the period not as a pétrifierre but as a beheader, her own head recognizably snaky yet still firmly attached to her shoulders. It may be that political theorists conflated the snake-haired Medusa with the many-headed Hydra, glossed by mythographers as political chaos, which grew 2 new heads for every one that was cut off. But Medusa's volatile femininity added another dangerous element. What Hertz calls the representation of what would seem to be a political threat as if it were a sexual threat locates in the Medusa figure something not only powerful but also elusive, elliptical, unable to be subdued. Feminists have long seen Medusa as an emblem of emancipation, and protesters against matriarchy and momism find Medusa the all-too-perfect emblem of what is wrong with powerful women. Since Freud's famous essay on Medusa's head, and even before it, the decapitation of Medusa has been read in some quarters as a sign of castration, and the presence of multiple snakes in her hair as a compensation for fears of losing the penis. It is the sight of the mother's genitalia, said Freud, that produces in the male child the fear that he himself will become castrated and provokes in him the defensive fantasy of the phallic mother or phallic woman. But this is not merely a fantasy. Some critics have replied, Medusa is both the sign of the possibility of phallic womanhood and an emblem of the punishment that power, wielded by women always attracts. What happens when a male figure takes on, or is imbued with, some of the attributes of Medusa? In Renaissance portraits of male rulers, Francis I of France or Cosimo I of Tuscany, for example, the wearing of the aegis of Athena is not a sign of feminization, but rather marks them as warriors. But in the case of Shakespeare's Macbeth, the slaying of the good King Duncan produces a new Gorgon that destroys the sight of the terrified Scottish onlookers, and Macbeth himself becomes an apotropaic figure warding off future tyranny when he is beheaded at the play's close. Freudian readings have established Medusa as the very type of the phallic woman, but what happens when the phallic woman is a man? Late 20th century male Medusas tend to be entertainment figures knowledgeably playing with gender. Goethe, Shelley, Pater, Rossetti, and Swinburne are among the many romantic artists obsessed with Medusa, who appears in their writings as a figure for art as well as for woman. The romantic Medusa is an object of beauty and terror, the tempestuous loveliness of terror, as Shelley writes in his poem on the Medusa of Leonardo da Vinci. Indeed, Shelley's Medusa head seems a relative of the shattered visage of Ozymandias he describes in a famous sonnet, the head of the immense statue of the king that now lies, a colossal wreck, upon the sands. Itlieth, his Medusa poem begins, gazing on the midnight sky / upon the cloudy mountain peak supine. But unlike Ozymandias's stone image with its frown and wrinkled lip, its empty sneer of command, the decapitated head of Medusa is sublime rather than ironic. It is less the horror than the grace / which turns the gazer's spirit into stone. Dante Gabriel Rossetti saw the Platonic power of shadows in the Medusa story, cautioning, let not thine eyes know / any forbidden thing itself but only safely seen in its reflection. Here too the danger of gazing is the danger of the sublime as well as the terrible, or the terrible as well as the sublime. Thus Medusa could be made to reflect, and refract, the doubled power and danger of poetic as well as visual representation. The ambivalence shown toward this dark double and muse becomes a recurrent motif emblematizing aestheticism and sexuality. It is perhaps not surprising that Medusa exercised a particular fascination for male writers and painters of the Romantic period. It would remain for 20th century feminism and psychoanalysis to regender and reframe the questions posed by this most problematic and elusive of figures. Theorists have shown a remarkable interest in the figure of Medusa, from Freud's suggestive brief essays to the works of contemporary critics like Roger Colloy, Helen Success, Teresa de Laurides, Stephen Heath, and Diana Fuss. The modern discourses of feminism, psychoanalysis, politics, and cultural history have been marked by a will to confront this singular figure, to look her, so to speak, in the face. While acknowledging that gazing at Medusa is always an activity performed and enacted obliquely and at risk, these most recent interpreters, psychoanalysts, anthropologists, film theorists, and poets as well as literary critics have taken a new look at Medusa and her story. In the 20th century, poet after poet comments on Medusa's eyes, the stiff bald eyes of Louise Bogan, the brilliantly blind Medusa of James Merrill, whose eyes upon pure intellection glare. Darrell Hines' slumbering Medusa dreams of the mate that she will never meet / who will look into her eyes and live. May Sarden boasts, I looked you straight in the cold eye, cold / I was not punished, was not turned to stone. By the poem's end she recognizes Medusa's face as her own. Count T. Cullen's Medusa, whom he initially fears for her basilisk eyes, is at the last a lovely face he braves, despite dire forebodings. His poem takes the form of a sonnet, the spectre of Medusa giving way to an emotion more like, merely, human love. But not all Medusas, close up, are so benign, or so reason-bred, to use Cullen's own term. In one of the most powerful and disturbing of all modern Gorgon poems, Sylvia Plath's Medusa, Old Barnaclede umbilicus, is both mother and jellyfish. Her mother's name, Aurelia, was close to that of the species of jellyfish, Aurela. The French word for jellyfish is Medus. She stages another encounter with Medusa through the figure of Perseus, armed with a mirror to keep the snaky head / in safe perspective, a funhouse mirror that turns the tragic muse / to the bedraggled head of a sullen doll. Of overwhelming importance to those concerned with the Medusa story has been the question of the status of the mirroring moment that immediately precedes Medusa's decapitation. What is it about the shield as mirror that permits the successful completion of Perseus's task? Is it that his deflected gaze permits him to look upon her with impunity? Or does a mirror image shown to Medusa serve in fact to stupefy her with her own appearance? In other words, is it his gaze or hers that costs her her life? This is a question that has been of special interest to theorists of representation, to psychoanalysts, and to psychoanalytic critics. Influenced by Jacques Lacan, many recent readers have interpreted Medusa's horror at seeing herself as a kind of mirror stage, in which gazer and gazed upon are locked in a dialectic of mutual reflection. What, then, of the look for the woman, asks film theorist Stephen Heath. Freud had posited the looker in the Medusa story as male. Heath continues, if the woman looks, the spectacle provokes, castration is in the air, the Medusa's head is not far off, thus, she must not look, is absorbed herself on the side of the scene, seeing herself, Lacan's femininity. Tobin Siebers calls this the like cures like logic of the amulet. Art critic Craig Owens calls the staging of an identification between the seer and the scene the Medusa effect. Owens notes that the most powerful position here becomes, paradoxically, that of the already frozen, the painting, the photograph, the posed and posing performer. A pose, then, is an apotrope. And to strike a pose is to pose a threat. The implications of this perception for theatre and advertising, for fashion, for the runway, for Madonna's restaging of the 1980s dance moves known as voguing are, as will be seen, remarkable and far-reaching. The connection between Madonna's voguing and the Medusa effect was, in fact, brilliantly enacted by performer Julie Brown's video parody Medusa, Dare to Be Truthful, a send-up of Madonna's 1991 film Truth or Dare. What film theorists like Heath and Teresa de Laurides saw in the gaze, fashion gurus could find in the pose. The pose was the Medusa effect as deployed in, and for, popular, as well as high, culture. What is especially striking is the way in which ancient and modern ways of looking at the Medusa have tended to coincide. Consider, for example, the ways in which Medusa has become a figure in the language of fashion. We might think of this as a phenomenon of the Romantic and Victorian periods with their decorative Medusas and their reminiscences of heraldry and the armorial tradition, or especially, perhaps, of the commercial culture of late 20th century advertising and beauty products. But in fact the Medusan aegis of Athena and the Medusa shield of Agamemnon are fashion statements on Homer's battlefield. Lucan's Pharsalia comments at some length on Medusa's fashion-forward hairstyle. Medusa loved to feel the serpents which served for hair curled close to her neck, and dangling down her back, but with their heads raised to form an impressive bang over her forehead in what has since become the fashionable female style at Rome. In the same spirit critic Roland Barthes, in his Mythologies, noted that bangs were the very label of Romanness in film. In the 1990s, Italian designer Gianni Versace adopted the Medusa as his personal signature, embossing perfume bottles, keychains, silk scarves, and other elegant apparel with her unmistakable countenance, and repeatedly arranging his models in Medusan and Persean attitudes. The fact that he himself later met his death at the hands of a crazed fan only adds to the aura of that representation. In 1995, pop diva Annie Lennox, a singer-songwriter whose career has depended both on her appreciable talent as a musician and her savvy manipulation of her own arresting image, reached the top 10 with an album titled simply, Medusa. Rather than evolving over time from one set of interpretations to another, the Medusa myth thus includes, from its very beginnings, all the conflicting elements that have fascinated audiences and readers. For that reason the selections in this volume have been placed chronologically rather than thematically. Our organization resists headings like beauty, or philosophy, or politics, or war, or gender, since most entries will defy any single label. For the use of interested readers, however, many such topics will be found in our extensive bibliography. Turning the pages of this book, caveat lector, the reader will encounter poems, pictorial images, cultural caricatures, diatribes, and political appropriations that offer a compelling composite glimpse of what Medusa might have meant throughout the ages. 1 Homer from the Iliad, c. 750 to 725 BCE, translated by Richmond Lattimore. Medusa as shield and sign. The most famous of Greek poets, Homer might best be considered a construction, because little is certain about this individual, no definite dates, no birthplace, no proof that he was the single author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, particularly since both incorporate earlier legends and descriptions. Yet, the consistency of plot and character suggest that each work is a unified whole. Regardless of these ambiguities, Homer's importance and influence are evident throughout subsequent classical and modern European literature. The Iliad, which tells the tale of the final year of the siege of Troy, was probably written c. 750 to 725 BCE. In the excerpt from Book 5, Athena claims Medusa's power as she dresses herself for battle. This image is echoed in Book 11, when Agamemnon dons the image of Medusa as he dresses to the sound of Athena's thunderbolt. Both pieces offer excellent early examples of the use of Medusa's face in martial attire. Now in turn Athene, daughter of Zeus of the Aegis, beside the threshold of her father slipped off her elaborate dress which she herself had wrought with her hands' patience, and now assuming the war tunic of Zeus who gathers the clouds, she armed in her gear for the dismal fighting. And across her shoulders she threw the Beta Celd, terrible Aegis, all about which terror hangs like a garland, and hatred is there, and battle strength, and heart-freezing onslaught, and thereon is set the head of the grim gigantic Gorgon, a thing of fear and horror, portent of Zeus of the Aegis. He took up the man enclosing elaborate stark shield, a thing of splendor. There were 10 circles of bronze upon it, and set about it were 20 knobs of tin, pale shining, and in the very center another knob of dark cobalt. Encircled in the midst of all was the blank-eyed face of the Gorgon with her stare of horror, and fear was inscribed upon it, and terror. The strap of the shield had silver upon it, and there also on it was coiled a cobalt snake, and there were 3 heads upon him twisted to look backward and grown from a single neck, all 3. 2 Hesiod from the shield of Heracles and Theogony, c. 700 BCE, translated by Richmond Lattimore. Medusa and Perseus. Hesiod was an early Greek poet, a self-described shepherd visited by muses who gave him the gift of song, a persona later invoked metaphorically by numerous poets. His Theogony, a genealogy of the pantheon of Greek gods, provides the earliest surviving systematic mythology and has served as a source for most subsequent theogonic literature. The traditional attribution of the shield of Heracles to Hesiod has been challenged in recent years. This excerpt from the shield gives little account of the fate of Medusa herself but describes in greater detail the fates and futures of her offspring. It also provides a vivid account of the rage of Medusa's sister Gorgons subsequent to her beheading. On Perseus' feet were the flying sandals, and across his shoulders was slung the black-bound sword, suspended on a sword belt of bronze, and he hovered like a thought in the mind, and all his back was covered with the head of the monster, the dreaded Gorgon, and the bag floated about it, a wonder to look at, done in silver, but the shining tassels fluttered, and they were gold, and the temples of the Lord Perseus were hooded over by the war-cap of Hades, which confers terrible darkness. The son of Danae, Perseus himself, sped onward, like one who goes in haste and terror, as meanwhile the rest of the Gorgons tumbled along behind him, unapproachable, indescribable, straining to catch and grab him, and on the green of the steel surface gibbered the sound of their feet on the shield running with a sharp high noise, and on the belts of the Gorgons a pair of snakes were suspended, but they reared and bent their heads forward and flickered with their tongues. The teeth for their rage were made jagged and their staring fierce, and over the dreaded heads of the Gorgons was great panic shivering. And to Phorcys Keto bore the Graeae, with fair faces and grey from birth, and these the gods who are immortal and men who walk on the earth call Graeae, the Grey Sisters, Pemphido robed in beauty and Enio robed in saffron, and the Gorgons who, beyond the famous stream of the ocean, live in the utmost place toward night, by the singing Hesperides, they are Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa, whose fate was a sad one, for she was mortal, but the other 2 immortal and ageless both alike. Poseidon, he of the dark hair, lay with one of these, in a soft meadow and among spring flowers. But when Perseus had cut off the head of Medusa there sprang from her blood great Chrysaor and the horse Pegasos, so named from the Pegi, the springs of the ocean, where she was born, while Chrysaor is named from the golden hour, the sword he handles. 3 Pindar Pythian 12, c. 490 BCE, translated by Geoffrey S. Conway. Medusa and music. Our knowledge of this famed Greek lyric poet is based largely on his own poems, leading biographers to differ on what is fact and what is poetic license. Still, we know that he was trained in Athens, traveled extensively throughout the ancient Greek world, and enjoyed prestige during both his lifetime and later into the Roman Empire. He is the best preserved of the Greek lyric poets, although all we possess today of his vast corpus is a selection of victory odes written in commemoration of various games, particularly those held at Olympia and Delphi. Pythian 12, with its sudden segue into the story of Medusa, is a prime example of Pindar's frequent mythological insertions and his characteristic non-linear retellings of myth. Of particular note is the poet's identification of Medusa and her Gorgon sisters as the origin of a popular music entitled The Many-Headed Tune. This link establishes a connection between Medusa and the arts. For Midas of Acragas, winner of the flute-playing contest, I pray you, lover of splendor, seat of Persephone, fairest of all cities of men, high built upon your hill above the stream of Acragas, and her rich banks of pasture, O Queen, grant of your gentle heart to accept this crown of Pytho, Midas' glory, and give him goodwill of the immortals and of men, welcome him too that he surpassed all Hellas in the art that long ago Pallas Athene invented, weaving in music's rich refrain the ghoulish dirge of the fierce-hearted Gorgons. This in their anguished struggle from those dread maidens' lips was heard streaming, and from those writhing serpent heads untouchable, when Perseus o'er the third of those fell sisters launched his cry of triumph, and brought fatal doom to Syrophoe by the sea, doom for that isle and for her people. Yes, for he had made blind the grim offspring of Phorcus, and bitter the wedding gift he brought to Polydectes, thus to end his mother's long slavery and enforced wedlock. That son of Danae who raped the head of the fair-cheeked Medusa, he who, men tell, was from a flowing stream of gold begotten. But when the goddess maid delivered from these labors this man she loved, then she contrived the manifold melodies of the flute, to make in music's notes an image of the shrill lamenting cries, strung from Muriel's ravening jaws. A goddess found, but finding, gave the strain to mortal men to hold, naming it the tune of many heads, a glorious grace for the great contests where the peoples gather. Often its clear call rings from the light bronze, and from the reeds which grow beside the Graces' city, home of lovely dances, where the nymph, daughter of Cephissus, has her precinct, faithful their witness to the dancers' feet. Now if a mortal man wins happy fortune not without toil shall this be seen, a god may bring it to pass today, maybe yes, but the will of fate none can escape. Soon shall there come an hour to strike beyond all expectation, and give one boon past hope, withhold another. For Euripides from Ion, c. 413 BCE, translated by Ronald Frederick Willits. The Power of Gorgon's Blood. A tragic dramatist and poet, the Athenian Euripides crafted numerous works focusing on the female psyche. Ion is as much the story of Creusa as of her son Ion raped by Apollo. Creusa abandons her baby, whom the gods take to Delphi to be raised as Apollo's servant. Years later, Apollo's priests give Ion to a childless Creusa, saying he is her husband Cephas's natural child. However, the truth is later revealed to mother and son, who are joyfully reunited. The play emphasizes Creusa's bitter pain and anger, questioning the gods' behavior and pitying her position first as a rape victim and then as a barren woman. In the scene presented here, Creusa, believing that Ion is Cephas's illegitimate son, plots to kill him with the Gorgon's blood. The dialogue stresses the Gorgon's origins, while the 2 drops of Gorgon's blood are an early manifestation of Medusa's simultaneous destructive and restorative powers. Old man, despairingly, you play the coward, come, give me your plan now. A pause, as she prepares to explain her scheme, she goes near to him, speaking softly and urgently, as if to emphasize her own resolution. Creusa, yes, I have something which is sure and subtle. Old man, and I can help in both these ways. Creusa, then listen. You know the war fought by Earth's sons? Old man, when giants fought against the gods at Phlegra. Creusa, Earth there produced an awful monster, Gorgon. Old man, to harass all the gods and help her children? Creusa, yes, but destroyed by Zeus's daughter Pallas. Old man, is this the tale which I have heard before? Creusa, yes, that she wears its skin upon her breast. Old man, Athene's armor which they call her Aegis? Creusa, so called from how she rushed into the battle. Old man, what was the form of this barbaric thing? Creusa, a breastplate armed with serpent coils. An impatient pause. Old man, but my child, what harm can this do to your foes? Creusa, you know Erichthonius, of course you must. Old man, the founder of your house, the son of Earth. Creusa, a newborn child Athene gave to him. She pauses. Old man, yes, what is this you hesitate to say? Creusa, slowly, 2 drops of Gorgon's blood. Old man, and these have some effect on men? Creusa, one is poisonous, the other cures disease. Old man, but how did she attach them to the child? Creusa, a golden chain which he gave to my father. Old man, and when he died it came to you? Creusa, yes, I always wear it on my wrist. Old man, how is the twofold gift compounded then? Creusa, the drop extracted from the hollow vein. Old man, how is it to be used? What power has it? Creusa, it fosters life and keeps away disease. Old man, what action does the other of them have? Creusa, it kills a poison from the Gorgon's snakes. Old man, you carry them apart or mixed together? Creusa, apart. For good and evil do not mingle. Old man, oh my dear child, you have all that you want. Creusa, by this the boy shall die, and you shall kill him. Old man, but when and how? Tell me, it shall be done. Creusa, in Athens when he comes into my house. A pause as the slave considers. Old man, no, I distrust this plan as you did mine. Creusa, why, can we both have seen the same weak point? Old man, they will accuse you, innocent or guilty. Creusa, since foster mothers must be jealous. Old man, but kill him now and so deny the crime. Creusa, and in that way I taste my joy the sooner. 5 Palophatus, the daughters of Phorcys, 4th century BCE, from On Unbelievable Tales translated by Jacob Stern. A rationalist view. Little information exists on this obscure Greek writer, but scholars believe that he spent most of his life in Athens, where he became a close friend of Aristotle. His only known work is titled Periapiston, On Unbelievable Tales, a collection of myths retold from a rationalizing perspective. Thus, in the Medusa myth, Palophatus explains that the Gorgon was really a golden statue of Athena, Medusa a strong-willed queen, and Perseus an unscrupulous pirate. Jacob Stern observes that the Graea and the Gorgons are conflated here. A single group of sisters are given the property held in common attribute of the former and the names of the latter. Stern also notes that another rationalizing interpretation of the eye of the Graea as a human being can be found in Heraclitus 13, where the eye is a guide used by the sisters when traveling. Palophatus's version of the Medusa story is one of the few in which Medusa is not, and does not become, a horrifying monster. However, she is still presented as a powerful female figure. About the daughters of Phorcys a much more ridiculous story is told, that Phorcys had 3 daughters who had only one eye which they used in succession. The one who was using it put it into her head and thus was able to see, she would then hand it off to the next, and so in their turn all could see. Now Perseus came up behind them stealthily and grabbed their eye. He said that he would not give it back unless they told him where the Gorgon was. And so they told him. Whereupon Perseus cut off the Gorgon's head and came with it to the island of Seriphos. There he showed it to Polydectes and turned him to stone. This last is particularly ridiculous, for a living man to be petrified by looking on the head of a corpse. For what could be the power of a dead body? What happened was the following. Phorcys was a Cernian by race. These are Ethiopians who live on the island of Cerne outside the Pillars of Heracles. The fields they till are Libyan by the river Anon, straight across from Carthage, and a gold-rich people they are. Now Phorcys was the king of the islands. There are 3 of them beyond the Pillars of Heracles, and he made a golden statue of Athene which was 6 feet tall. The Cernaeans, it should be noted, call Athene Gorgon, just as Artemis is called Bendis by the Thracians, Dictina by the Cretans, and Opis by the Lacedaemonians. Phorcys, however, died before dedicating the statue in the temple, and was survived by his 3 daughters, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa. These had no desire to marry, but instead distributed their father's property among themselves so that each ruled over one of the 3 islands. As for the Gorgon, they decided not to dedicate it nor to divide it up. Rather by turns they each kept it as their own treasure. Before his death, Phorcys had had a noble companion, and the 3 daughters continued to avail themselves of him in all matters. He was, as it were, their eye. Now Perseus, an exile from Argos, was making piratical raids with ships and troops along the sea coast. When he found out that there was a kingdom there in the hands of women which was also rich in gold and had only a few men, he approached. He first lay in ambush in the Nar Rose between Cerne and Sarpedonea, then, as the eye was sailing across from one to the other, Perseus seized him. The eye told Perseus that there was nothing worth taking from the sisters but the Gorgon, and he also revealed how much gold was in it. As for the sisters themselves, when the eye on his rounds failed to arrive according to their agreement, they came together and began to accuse each other. But each of them denied that she was holding the eye, and they all began to wonder what might have happened. At that very moment, while they were all together, Perseus sailed against them. He announced that he was holding the eye and that he would not return him, unless they told him where the Gorgon was. He threatened in addition to kill them, if they did not tell him. Now Medusa refused to tell, but Stheno and Euryale did. Perseus therefore slew Medusa and returned the eye to the other two sisters. When he got his hands on the Gorgon, Perseus cut it in pieces, then, by way of fitting out his trireme, he put the head of the Gorgon on it and thereafter called the ship by the name Gorgon. Sailing around in this ship he exacted money from the islanders and slew those who refused to give. In this way he sailed eventually against the people of Seriphos and demanded money from them. They in turn asked for a few days' time in which to collect the money. But instead they brought together and set up man-sized stones in the marketplace and then abandoned the island of Seriphos. Perseus sailed back to demand his money, but when he came into the marketplace he found no men but rather the man-sized stones. Thereafter, whenever any of the other island people would not pay their tribute, Perseus would say, "Be careful that you too do not suffer what the people of Seriphos did, who saw the Gorgon's head and were turned to stone." 6 Apollodorus from the Library, 2nd century BCE, translated by James George Fraser. The beauty of Medusa. The Athenian scholar Apollodorus is now thought to have authored none of the works traditionally attributed to him, though for convenience his name is still used. The Bibliotheca is a study of Greek heroic myth, which may have been composed as late as the 2nd century CE, some time after Apollodorus's actual lifetime. This excerpt emphasizes Athena's strong-willed complicity in the beheading of Medusa. In this account Perseus receives assistance from a variety of female figures who serve as involuntary accomplices in the attack on the Gorgon. When Acrisius inquired of the oracle how he should get male children, the god said that his daughter would give birth to a son who would kill him. Fearing that, Acrisius built a brazen chamber underground and there guarded Danae. However, she was seduced, as some say, by Proetus, whence arose the quarrel between them, but some say that Zeus had intercourse with her in the shape of a stream of gold which poured through the roof into Danae's lap. When Acrisius afterwards learned that she had got a child Perseus, he would not believe that she had been seduced by Zeus, and putting his daughter with the child in a chest, he cast it into the sea. The chest was washed ashore on Seriphos, and Dictys took up the boy and reared him. Polydectes, brother of Dictys, was then king of Seriphos and fell in love with Danae, but could not get access to her, because Perseus was grown to man's estate. So he called together his friends, including Perseus, under the pretext of collecting contributions toward a wedding gift for Hippodamia, daughter of Oenomas. Now Perseus having declared that he would not stick even at the Gorgon's head, Polydectes required the others to furnish horses, and not getting horses from Perseus ordered him to bring the Gorgon's head. So under the guidance of Hermes and Athena he made his way to the daughters of Phorcys, to wit, Io, Pephardo, and Dino, for Phorcys had them by Ceto, and they were sisters of the Gorgons, and old women from their birth. The three had but one eye and one tooth, and these they passed to each other in turn. Perseus got possession of the eye and the tooth, and when they asked them back, he said he would give them up if they would show him the way to the nymphs. Now these nymphs had winged sandals and the kybesis, which they say was a wallet. But Pindar and Hesiod in the shield say of Perseus, but all his back had on the head of a dread monster, the Gorgon, and round him ran the kybesis. The kybesis is so called because dress and food are deposited in it. They had also the cap of Hades. When the four sides had shown him the way, he gave them back the tooth and the eye, and coming to the nymphs got what he wanted. So he slung the wallet, kybesis, about him, fitted the sandals to his ankles, and put the cap on his head. Wearing it, he saw whom he pleased, but was not seen by others. And having received also from Hermes an adamantine sickle he flew to the ocean and caught the Gorgons asleep. They were Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa. Now Medusa alone was mortal, for that reason Perseus was sent to fetch her head. But the Gorgons had heads twined about with the scales of dragons, and great tusks like swines, and brazen hands, and golden wings, by which they flew, and they turned to stone such as beheld them. So Perseus stood over them as they slept, and while Athena guided his hand and he looked with averted gaze on a brazen shield, in which he beheld the image of the Gorgon, he beheaded her. When her head was cut off, there sprang from the Gorgon the winged horse Pegasus and Chrysaor, the father of Geryon, these she had by Poseidon. So Perseus put the head of Medusa in the wallet, Chybisus, and went back again, but the Gorgons started up from their slumber and pursued Perseus, but they could not see him on account of the cap, for he was hidden by it. Being come to Ethiopia, of which Cepheus was king, he found the king's daughter Andromeda set out to be the prey of a sea monster. For Cassiope, the wife of Cepheus, vied with the Nereids in beauty and boasted to be better than them all, hence the Nereids were angry, and Poseidon, sharing their wrath, sent a flood and a monster to invade the land. But Ammon having predicted deliverance from the calamity if Cassiopei's daughter Andromeda were exposed as a prey to the monster, Cepheus was compelled by the Ethiopians to do it, and he bound his daughter to a rock. When Perseus beheld her, he loved her and promised Cepheus that he would kill the monster, if he would give him the rescued damsel to wife. These terms having been sworn to, Perseus withstood and slew the monster and released Andromeda. However, Phaeneus, who was a brother of Cepheus, and to whom Andromeda had been first betrothed, plotted against him, but Perseus discovered the plot, and by showing the Gorgon turned him and his fellow conspirators at once into stone. And having come to Seriphus he found that his mother and Dictys had taken refuge at the altars on account of the violence of Polydectes, so he entered the palace, where Polydectes had gathered his friends, and with averted face he showed the Gorgon's head, and all who beheld it were turned to stone, each in the attitude which he happened to have struck. Having appointed Dictys king of Seriphus, he gave back the sandals and the wallet, Chybisus, and the cap to Hermes, but the Gorgon's head he gave to Athena. Hermes restored the aforesaid things to the nymphs and Athena inserted the Gorgon's head in the middle of her shield. But it is alleged by some that Medusa was beheaded for Athena's sake, and they say that the Gorgon was fain to match herself with the goddess even in beauty. 7 Diodorus Siculus from the Historical Library, c. 60–30 BCE, translated by G. Booth. The Gorgons and the Amazons in Africa. The history of Diodorus the Sicilian, or Diodorus Siculus, covers earliest times through Caesar's Gallic War and attempts to include all known civilizations. The work is a library in the sense of a collection of other historians' writings, a fact that marks both its value and its limitations for modern readers. The excerpted discussion of North Africa in Book 3 provides an early connection of Medusa with Africa. The comparison of the Gorgons with the Amazons is particularly interesting. Both Gorgons and Amazons are races of women whose courage and power bring them triumph, but they also are enemies to each other and are eventually destroyed by Hercules as a symbol of his opposition to female rulers. In Africa there was not one race only of women who were famous for valor and warlike exploits, for we are informed that the Gorgons, against whom Perseus made war, for courage and valor were eminent. How famous and potent they were, may be gathered hence, inasmuch as that son of Jupiter, the most eminent hero among the Grecians in his time, made choice of this expedition as the greatest and most noble enterprise. And as for the Amazons, of whom we are now about to write, their valor was most eminently remarkable, if we compare them with the greatest spirited women of our own times. In the western parts of Africa, upon the borders of those tracts that are inhabitable, there were anciently a nation under the government of women, whose manners and course of living were altogether different from ours. It was the custom for those women to manage all matters of war, and, for a certain time keeping themselves virgins, they went out as soldiers into the field, and, after so many years spent in their warfare, they accompanied with men, for the preservation of posterity, but the magistracy, and all public offices, they kept wholly in their own hands, and the men, as the women do with us, looked to the household affairs, submitting to whatever was thought fit to be done by the wives, and were not upon any terms admitted to intermeddle in martial affairs, or to command, or be in any public authority, which might anyways encourage them to cast off the yoke of their wives. As soon as any child was born, they delivered it to the father to nurse it up with milk and other meat agreeable to its age. If it were a girl, they seared off its paps, lest they should be burnt handsome when they grew up, for they looked upon them to be great hindrances in fighting, and from the searing of their paps, the Grecians called them Amazons. It is reported they inhabit an island called Hesperia, because it lies to the west, near to the morass called Tritonus. This fen, they say, is near to the ocean, which surrounds it, and is called Titrones, from a river that runs into it, called Titron. This morass borders upon Ethiopia, under the greatest mountain in those parts, called by the Grecians Atlas, extending itself to the ocean. This island, they say, is very large, abounding with all sorts of fruit trees, which supply the inhabitants with food, that they have many herds of cattle, and flocks of sheep and goats, which feed their possessors both with their milk and flesh, but that they had no sort of corn, for that in those times they knew not what it was. These Amazons, therefore, for valor eminent above all others, and heated with an ambitious desire of war, first subdued all the cities of this island, except one called Mina, accounted sacred, inhabited now by the Ethiopians, called Ichthyophages. It is often scorched with many eruptions of fire, which break out of the earth, and its bowels are enriched with precious stones, which the Grecians call anthraces, sards, and smaragdos. Afterwards, having subdued many of the neighboring Africans and Numidians, they built a great city in the morass Tritonus, which for the shape of it was called Chersonesus. Then being further instigated by their innate valor and courage, they attempted greater matters, and invaded many other countries. And first they attacked them upon Mount Atlas, a soft sort of people, who enjoyed a rich country full of great cities, among whom, in those parts bordering upon the ocean, the gods first had their origin, as the Grecians fabulously report, of whom a particular account shall be given hereafter. To this end, when Marina was queen of the Amazons, she raised an army of 30,000 foot, and 2,000 horse, for they were very exact and diligent in training up horses for the war. The armor they wore for coats of mail, were the skins of vast serpents, with which sort of creatures Africa abounds. But for offensive arms, they carried swords, darts, and bows, in which they were so expert, that with these they not only broke their enemies' battalions, but when they pursued them upon their flight, they were sure to hit their mark. Entering, therefore, the country of the Atlantides, in a battle they routed them that inhabited Cercine, and pursued them so close, that they entered pell-mell with them that got within the walls, and took the city, and to strike a greater terror into their neighbours, they executed horrid cruelties upon the conquered, for they put all the men to the sword, and having razed the city to the ground, carried away captive all the women and children. The noise of this destruction being spread all over the country, the rest of the Atlantides, being struck with a panic fear, submitted, and delivered up all their cities, whereupon Marina received them all into her favour, and made a league with them, and in the room of that which was destroyed, built another city, calling it after her own name, and peopled it with the captives, and with such as were willing to come there to inhabit. In the meantime being presented by the Atlantides with many rich gifts, and decreeing to her, with a general consent, many high honours, she not only graciously accepted those marks of their kindness, but promised she would for the future endeavour to merit the good opinion of the whole nation. Being, therefore, often infested by their envious neighbours the Gorgons, Marina, to gratify the Atlantides, who addressed themselves to her for that purpose, with an army invaded the country of the Gorgons, where, joining battle with them, the engagement was smart, in which the Amazons got the day, and killed great numbers of their enemies, and took 3,000 prisoners, the rest flying into woods. Marina, designing utterly to root up the nation, endeavoured to set the woods on fire, but, not being able to effect it, she returned with her army into the confines of her own country, where, by reason of her late victory, being secure and careless in setting her watch, the prisoners killed many of her Amazons with their own swords as they were asleep, but at length, being surrounded by the whole army, fighting it out to the last, they were every man killed upon the spot. Then Marina erected 3 funeral piles, and burnt up all those of her army that were slain, in Africa, and raised up as many mounts of earth over them, which are at this day called the Amazons' sepulchres. The Gorgons, notwithstanding, were afterwards of great power, till the reign of Medusa, at which time they were conquered by Perseus. At length both they and the Amazons were utterly extirpated by Hercules, at the time when he travelled into the western parts, and erected the pillar in Africa. For it was a thing intolerable to him, who made it his business to be renowned all the world over, to suffer any nation to be governed any longer by women. 8 Ovid from Metamorphoses, c. 43b.c.e, 17 CE, translated by Rolfe Humphreys. The story of Perseus. Ovid, a poet and well-known figure in Rome, is best known today as the author of Metamorphoses, an encyclopedic narrative of more than 200 legends involving physical transformations. The work has influenced centuries of European writers and authors as a major source for Roman legends. In the story of Perseus and the fighting of Perseus, excerpted here, the slain Medusa is a source of power for Perseus, a means to avenge affronts, win a wife, and defend himself against rivals. By the time he battles to save Andromeda, Perseus recognizes that Medusa's head must be cared for and preserved as a vital source of his own power. Although Medusa is treated only indirectly, through Perseus's tale, the position of the beautiful woman as both threat and threatened links her to Andromeda. Medusa provides the subject of Perseus's wedding story and the means for the glorious victories that make up Perseus's own tale. The story of Perseus. India, conquered, worshipped Bacchus, Greece thronged to his temples. King Acrisius only, of the same stock, still kept him out of Argos, took arms against the god, would not admit him the son of Jove. Nor would he grant that Perseus was also son of Jove, the child begotten on Danae in the golden reign. But truth is powerful. Acrisius learned repentance for his attack on the god, and his denial of his own grandson. Bacchus was in heaven, but Perseus, bringing back the wondrous trophy of the snake-haired monster, through thin air was cleaving his way on whirring wings. As he flew over the Libyan sands, drops from the Gorgon's head fell bloody on the ground, and earth received them, turning them into vipers. For this reason Libya, today, is full of deadly serpents. From there he drove through space, the warring winds bearing him every way, as a squall is driven. From his great height he looked on lands outspread far, far below. He flew the whole world over, saw the cold bears, 3 times, and saw the crab with curving claws, 3 times, whirled often eastward, whirled often to the west. As the day ended, fearful of night, he came down for a landing on the west's edge, the realm of Atlas, seeking a little rest, till the morning star should waken the fires of dawn, and dawn lead out the chariot of the new day. Atlas, Iapetus' offspring, loomed over all men in his great bulk of body. He ruled this land and the sea whose waters take the sun's tired horses and the weary wheels at the long day's end. He had 1,000 herds, no neighbors, and he had a tree, all shining with gold, whose golden leaves hid golden branches, whose golden branches hung with golden apples. Perseus greeted Atlas, "If the glory of lofty birth has any meaning for you, I am the son of Jove. If you prefer to wonder at great deeds, you will find that mine are very wonderful. I ask for rest, for friendly shelter." But Atlas, doubtful, thought of an ancient oracle of Themis. "Atlas, the time will come when your tree loses its gold, and the marauder is Jove's son." Fearful of this, Atlas had walled his orchard, given its keeping to a monstrous dragon, and kept all strangers off. He answered Perseus, "Get out of here, you liar! Neither Jove nor glory gets you entrance here." He added a lusty shove, though Perseus resisted, argued, and tried appeasement. But at last, inferior in strength, for who could equal the strength of Atlas, he told the giant, "Well, anyway, since you will give me nothing, I have something here for you." He turned his back, held up, with his left hand behind his body, Medusa's terrible head, and, big as he was, Atlas was all at once a mountain. Beard and hair were forests, and his arms and shoulders were mountain ridges. What had been his head was the peak of the mountain, and his bones were boulders. But still he grew, for so the gods had willed it, and his great bulk upheld the starry heaven. And Aeolus by now had closed the winds in their eternal prison. The bright star that wakes men to their toil, had risen brightly in the clear morning air, and Perseus fastened his winged sandals to his feet, took up the scimitar, and soared aloft. Below him lay many lands, and finally he saw the Ethiopians, King Cepheus' people. There the god Ammon, not without injustice, ordered a daughter, who had not deserved it, to pay the penalty for her mother's talking, and Perseus saw her there, Andromeda, bound by the arms to the rough rocks, her hair, stirred in a gentle breeze, and her warm tears flowing proved her not marble, as he thought, but woman. She was beautiful, so much so that he almost forgot to move his wings. He came down to her saying, "My dear, the chains that ought to bind you are love knots rather than shackles. May I ask you your name, your country, the reason for this bondage?" At first she made no answer, too much the virgin to speak to any man. She would have hidden her modest features with her hands, but could not since they were bound. Her eyes were free, and filling with rising tears. And Perseus urged her, gently, not to seem too unwilling, but to tell him what wrong she had done, if any. So, at last, she gave her name, her country, adding further how her mother had bragged too much about her beauty. She had not told it all, when the sea roared and over the sea a monster loomed and towered above the wave. She cried aloud. Her parents were near at hand, both grieving, but the mother more justly so, and they brought no help with them, only the kind of tears and vain embraces proper on such occasions. This struck Perseus as pretty futile. There is time, and plenty, for weeping, later, he told them, but the moment for help is very short. If I were here as suitor, I, Perseus, son of Jove and Danae, conqueror of the snaky-headed Gorgon, the daring flyer through the winds of heaven, you would accept me, I think, before all others. But to such great endowments I am trying to add, with the gods' blessing, a greater service. If I save her by my valor, do I have her? What could they say but yes? They promised also a kingdom as her dowry. As a galley bears down, with all the sturdy sweating rowers driving it hard, so came the monster, thrusting the water on both sides in a long billow. A slinger from the cliff could almost hit him when Perseus rose cloudward, and his shadow fell on the surface, and the monster, seeing that shadow, raged against it. As an eagle sees, in open field, a serpent sunning its mottled back, comes swooping down upon it, grasps it behind its head, to miss the poison sent through the deadly fangs, and buries talons in scaly neck, so Perseus came plunging in his steep dive down air, attacked the monster that roared as the right shoulder took the sword blade up to the hilt. The wound hurt deep, the sea beast reared, lashed, and dived, and thrashed, as a wild boar does when the hounds bay around him. Perseus rose when the fangs struck, he poised, he sought for openings along the barnacled back, along the sides, at tapering fishy tail. The monster's vomit was blood and salty water. The winged sandals grew heavy from that spew, and Perseus dared not depend upon them further. He found a rock projecting out of the sea when the waves were still, hidden in storm. There he hung on, from there he struck, again, and the sword went deep into the vitals, and the shores re-echoed to heaven with applause. Father and mother, rejoicing, hail their son-in-law, the savior of all the house. The chains are loosened from the girl's arms, and she comes slowly forward, the cause, and the reward, of all that labor. Water is brought so that the victor may wash his hands clean of blood, before he washes, lest the hard sand injure the Gorgon's head. He makes it soft with leaves, and over them strews seaweed for a cover, and puts down Medusa's head. And the twigs, all fresh and pliant, absorb another force, harden and stiffen in branch and leaves. The sea nymphs test the wonder with other boughs, and the same wonder happens to their delight, and they use the twigs as seedlings, strewing them over the water. And even now such is the nature of coral, that it hardens, exposed to air, a vine below the surface. Now Perseus built 3 altars to 3 gods, the left for Mercury, the right for Pallas, the central one for Jove, and sacrificed heifer and bull and yearling steer. He wanted no dowry save Andromeda in payment of his reward. And Love and Hymen shook the marriage torches, fires fed fat on incense, glowing and fragrant, and the garlands hung down from the timbers, and the lyre and flute and song made music, proof of happy spirits. Great doors swung open, and the golden halls were set for splendid banqueting, and courtiers came thronging to the tables. So they feasted and took their fill of wine, and all were happy, and Perseus asked them questions about the region, people, and customs and the native spirit. They told him, and they asked in turn, "Now tell us, heroic Perseus, how you slew the Gorgon." He told them how there lay, beneath cold Atlas, a place protected by the bulk of the mountain where dwelt twin sisters, daughters, both, of Phorcys. They had one eye between them, and they shared it, passing it from one sister to the other, and he contrived to steal it, being so handed, and slipped away, going by trackless country, rough woods, and jagged rocks, to the Gorgon's home. On all sides, through the fields, along the highways, he saw the forms of men and beasts, made stone by one look at Medusa's face. He also had seen that face, but only in reflection from the bronze shield his left hand bore. He struck while snakes and Gorgon both lay sunk in slumber, severed the head, and from that mother's bleeding were born the swift-winged Pegasus and his brother. And he went on to tell them of his journeys, his perils over land and sea, the stars he had brushed on flying pinions. And they wanted still more, and someone asked him why Medusa, alone of all the sisters, was snaky-haired. Their guest replied, "That, too, is a tale worth telling. She was very lovely once, the hope of many an envious suitor, and of all her beauties her hair most beautiful, at least I heard so from one who claimed he had seen her. One day Neptune found her and raped her, in Minerva's temple, and the goddess turned away, and hid her eyes behind her shield, and, punishing the outrage as it deserved, she changed her hair to serpents, and even now, to frighten evildoers, she carries on her breastplate metal vipers to serve as awful warning of her vengeance." The fighting of Perseus. So Perseus told his story, and the halls buzzed loud, not with the cheery noise that rings from floor to rafter at a wedding party. No, this meant trouble. It was like the riot when sudden squalls lash peaceful waves to surges. Phineus was the reckless one to start it, that warfare, brandishing his spear of ash with sharp bronze point. "Look at me. Here I am," he cried, "avenger of my stolen bride. No wings will save you from me, and no god turned into lying gold." He poised the spear, as Cepheus shouted, "Are you crazy, brother? What are you doing? Is this our gratitude, this our repayment for a maiden saved? If truth is what you want, it was not Perseus who took her from you, but the Nereids whose power is terrible, it was horned Ammon, it was that horrible monster from the ocean who had to feed on my own flesh and blood, and that was when you really lost her, brother, she would have died. Can your heart be so cruel to wish it so, to heal its grief by causing grief in my heart? It was not enough, I take it, for you to see her bound and never help her, never so much as lift a little finger, and you her uncle and her promised husband. So now you grieve that someone else did save her, you covet his reward, a prize so precious, it seems, you could not force yourself to take it from the rocks where it was bound. Let him alone. He took her from the rocks. I am not childless, now, nor in my old age. He has earned his prize, I keep my word. You have this much of comfort, the choice was not between two men, but rather between one man and death." There was no answer, as Phineus looked in doubt from one to the other, wondering which to let alone, and waited, and then, with all the strength that anger gave him, let fly the spear at Perseus, but the weapon missed, piercing through the bench's coverings, and Perseus, all warrior, leaped down and flung it back again, and would have killed him, but Phineus cringed and hid behind the altar and so found safety, but the spearpoint found another victim, it drove through Rhoetus' forehead. Somebody pulled it loose, and Rhoetus grovelled, spattering blood across the ground and tables. Nothing could stop them now. Here ensues an extended battle between those loyal to Perseus and those loyal to Phineus. Perseus knew his strength at last would fail before those endless numbers. "Since you ask it," he cried, "I call my enemy to help me. If any friend is here," he raised it high, the Gorgon's head, "if any friends are here, then turn away your faces." Thessalus answered, "Seek someone else to frighten with your magic," and raised his javelin, and became a statue poised for a javelin throw. The next was Ampyx, who thrust a sword, and felt the right hand stiffen, the wrist grow rigid. Nilius, a liar, who said his father was the famous river whose 7 mouths, part silver and part gold, he wore as shield's device, called, "See, O Perseus, the fountain of my blood, and take this comfort down to the silent shades, a hero killed you." The last words broke, half-spoken. If you saw him so, open-mouthed, you might perhaps have wondered why the lips made no sound, for all they tried to. They were cowards both, thought Eryx, and he said so, said there was nothing in this Gorgon magic, urged them to join his charge, and he was charging, or would have charged, but the floor seemed to hold him, and there he stood, a flinty man, unmoving, a monument in armor. They deserved it, all three, but there was one, a soldier fighting on Perseus' side, a contus, whose bad luck it was to see the Gorgon, and what happened afflicted friend, for once, and not a foeman. Astyages, mistaking rock for flesh, for living flesh, struck at him, and the sword rang with a sound not made on flesh or armor, and as it rang, Astyages, in wonder, was wondering marble. It would take too long to tell the names of all of those who perished. 200 men survived, at least as many looked at the Gorgon and were turned to stone. And Phineus, now, repents this evil warfare, but what is there to do? He sees them all images, posing, and he knows each one by name, and calls each one by name, imploring each one for help. Seeing is not believing. He touches the nearest bodies, and he finds them all marble, all. He turns his face away, holds out his hands, cautiously, sidewise, pleading, "You win, O Perseus! Take away that monster, that face that makes men stone, whoever she is, Medusa, or no matter, take her away. No hate for you, no lust for power drove me into this fight, it was my bride I fought for. Your claim was better in merit, mine in time. I yield, and gladly, and now I ask for nothing except my life, let all the rest be yours." And all the time he spoke, he dared not look at the man he spoke to. Perseus made answer, "Dismiss your fear, great coward, I can give you a great memorial, not by the sword are you to die, you shall endure for ages, be seen for ages, in your brother's household, a comfort for my wife, her promised husband, his very image." And he swung the head so Phineus had to see it. As he struggled to turn his eyes, his neck grew hard, his tears were changed to marble, and in marble still the suppliant look, the pleading hands, the pose, the cringe, all these were caught and fixed forever. 9 Lucan from Pharsalia, c. 61-65, translated by Robert Graves. Medusa and the Snakes of Libya. A member of an important Spanish family, Lucan was favored by Nero, but upon falling from favor and joining a conspiracy against the emperor, he was compelled to commit suicide. Of all his writings, only the Pharsalia survives. Still unfinished at the time of Lucan's death, the Pharsalia relates the story of the civil war between Pompey and Julius Caesar, with strong sympathy for Pompey and the cause of the Republic. This excerpt from Book 9 serves as a digression from the text's description of Cato leading the troops through North Africa after Pompey's death. In this passage, the story of Medusa is associated closely with the scalding North African desert and the venomous power of that region's snakes. Having been unable to ascertain why the soil of Libya is mysteriously plagued with such myriads of venomous reptiles, I can do no better than record the delusive but widespread legend of Medusa, daughter of Phorcys. Medusa is said to have lived in the far west of Africa, at the point where the ocean laps against the hot earth, in a wide, untilled, treeless region which she had turned entirely to stone merely by gazing around her. The story is that, when her head was cut off, serpents were bred from the fallen blood and came hissing out to display their forked tongues. Medusa loved to feel the serpents, which served for hair curled close to her neck and dangling down her back, but with their heads raised to form an impressive bang over her forehead in what has since become the fashionable female style at Rome. And when she used a comb, their poison would flow freely. Those serpents were the only part of the luckless Medusa which one could study without being turned to stone. Nobody ever felt fear as he gazed at that monster's grinning face, because he had no time to feel any emotion whatsoever. One could not even describe what happened to him as death, for being prevented from gasping out his spirit, this became petrified with his body. A sight of the Furies' serpent locks causes simple madness, and when Orpheus played his lyre in the underworld he glanced unharmed at the serpents of Cerberus's mane, which presently ceased hissing. Hercules, too, was able to decapitate, without danger, the serpent heads which sprouted from the Hydra's neck. But Medusa was dreaded by her own father Phorcys, Neptune's second in command, by her mother Ceto, and even by her sister Gorgons. She had the extraordinary power of paralysing everything in sea, in sky, or on earth by turning it to stone. Birds suddenly grew heavy and crashed to the ground, beasts stood frozen on their rocks, entire tribes of neighboring Ethiopians were transformed to statues. No living creature, in fact, could bear to look at that face, not even the serpents on her head, which explains why they curled back from her forehead. Moreover, Medusa's head made Titan, the giant who supports the western pillars, turn to stone, and eventually saved the day for the Olympian gods, when Pallas Athene wore it in the center of her aegis at the terrible battle of Phlegra, and converted the snake-legged giants into mountains. It was to Medusa's lair that Perseus, son of that Danae whom Jupiter had wooed in a shower of gold, went flying with the winged sandals given him by the Arcadian god Hermes. When Pallas Athene saw him heading west, and recognized the sandals and the falchion in his hand as belonging to her half-brother, inventor of the lyre and the oil which wrestlers use, she decided to help him. The falchion, by the way, was already stained with the blood of hundred-eyed Argus, the giant ordered by Jupiter to guard Io, daughter of Inachus, whom Juno had metamorphosed into a heifer. Athene offered Perseus a bargain: if he promised her Medusa's head she would show him how to cut it off. Then she placed a polished bronze shield in his left hand, and told him that when he reached the Libyan frontier he must fly backwards through Gorgon territory and employ the shield as a mirror, thus avoiding petrifaction. Perseus found Medusa asleep. It was to be her last sleep, but some of the serpents on her head kept watch and darted out to protect her, while the rest lay draped like a curtain over her face and closed eyes. He felt somewhat nervous and the falchion trembled in his hand, but Athene guided the blow, which he struck while looking at the shield, and it fell clean at the junction of head and body. Medusa's features must have worn a ghastly grimace in the moment of her decapitation. I have no doubt that the mouth belched poison and the eyes flashed instant death. Athene herself could not look at those eyes, and though Perseus had averted his face he would nevertheless have been petrified, had she not ruffled Medusa's hair and made the dead serpents serve as a veil. Then he seized the head and soared safely away. Perseus had planned to take the quickest route across Europe, but Athene forbade this, asking him to consider the damage he would do if he passed over cities and cultivated lands. On seeing such a large object flying aloft, everyone would look up, and be turned to stone. The corn would also be ruined. So he wheeled about and with the west wind behind him sailed across Libya, because that was an untilled region, viewed only by the sun and the stars. In Libya, as I have already explained, the sun travels straight overhead, burning up the soil, another effect being that, when the sun passes exactly underneath, the conical shadow of the earth rises higher here than anywhere else, so that if the moon were to forget her usual slanting orbit and run along the zodiac, without troubling to pass either north or south of the earth's shadow, she would find herself eclipsed. Thus, though the Libyan soil was sterile and the fields unproductive, they drank the poisonous blood, dripping from Medusa's head, which became more poisonous still by contact with the loose burning earth. The first snake to spring from the ground after this rain of Gorgon's blood was the deadly asp with its puffed neck, and since the blood happened to be particularly abundant at this point, and mixed with clotted venom, it proved to be the most deadly of all the Libyan varieties. The asp loves heat and therefore never visits cold regions, always keeping to the desert west of the Nile, so we should be ashamed to have let our mercantile instincts get the better of us by importing this African poison into Italy. 10 Lucian from the Hall, c. 120–180, translated by A. M. Harman. The Sirens and the Gorgons. A Greek writer known for his wit, Lucian used the dialogue form to satirize his contemporaries. In the first of 2 excerpts from his work The Hall, Lucian explains that it is the beauty of the Gorgons that transfixes beholders, and there is no reference to Medusa's transformation into an horrific sight. The second excerpt describes a wall hanging that depicts Perseus using Medusa's head in his battle to free Andromeda. That the power of the tongue is no match for the eyes, one can learn by comparing the story of the Sirens with the one about the Gorgons. The Sirens charmed passing voyagers by making music and working on them with songs, and held them long when they put in. In short, their performance only exacted a delay, and no doubt one or another voyager went by them, neglecting their music. On the contrary, the beauty of the Gorgons, being extremely powerful and affecting the very vitals of the soul, stunned its beholders and made them speechless, so that, as the story has it and everyone says, they turned to stone in wonder. Then comes Perseus again, in the adventure which preceded the sea monster. He is cutting off the head of Medusa, and Athena is shielding him. He has done the daring deed, but has not looked, except at the reflection of the Gorgon in the shield, for he knows the cost of looking at the reality. 11 Pausanias from Description of Greece, c. 143–176, translated by W. H. S. Jones. Another rationalist view. Pausanias, also called the Guide, was a late 2nd century writer from Lydia who travelled extensively throughout Egypt, Palestine, Italy, Rome, and Greece. His only known work, excerpted here, is a description of Greece, based on his journeys. Divided into 10 books, the description strives both to entertain and to educate the reader about the country and its heritage. With attention to folklore, local stories, and guides, Pausanias attempts to distinguish between legend and reality. Medusa appears in his section on Corinth, where a mound near the Argos marketplace was said to be her buried head. True to the work's pedantic purpose, Pausanias dismisses what he sees as the more miraculous aspects of the story in favor of a version describing Medusa as a Libyan warrior queen. Perseus remains a Greek prince, but one at war with Medusa's tribe. After she is assassinated, he decapitates her in order to show off her indescribable beauty to his fellow Greeks. Not far from the building in the marketplace of Argos is a mound of earth, in which they say lies the head of the Gorgon Medusa. I omit the miraculous, but give the rational parts of the story about her. After the death of her father, Phorcys, she reigned over those living around Lake Tritonis, going out hunting and leading the Libyans to battle. On one such occasion, when she was encamped with an army over against the forces of Perseus, who was followed by picked troops from the Peloponnesus, she was assassinated by night. Perseus, admiring her beauty even in death, cut off her head and carried it to show the Greeks. 12 Achilles Tatius from the Adventures of Leucippe and Cleitophon, 2nd century, translated by John Winkler. Medusa and the Power of Ekphrasis. Achilles Tatius is the author of the ancient Greek novel The Adventures of Leucippe and Cleitophon. In the passage we quote, the two lovers of the novel's title come upon a diptych in a temple in Egypt. In it they see a depiction of Andromeda bound to a rock and menaced by a sea monster. Perseus, flying by, uses the Gorgon's head as a weapon against the monster. Achilles' account is a brilliant rhetorical ekphrasis, a literary work that describes a specific work of painting or sculpture. Andromeda, chained to a rock, resembles a statue, and Medusa's head seems a graphic delineation of intimidation. Andromeda's arms were spread against the rock, bound above her head by a manacle bolted in the stone. Her hands hung loose at the wrist like clusters of grapes. The color of her arms shaded from pure white to livid, and her fingers looked dead. She was chained up waiting for death, wearing a wedding garment, adorned as a bride for Hades. Her robe reached the ground, the whitest of robes, delicately woven, like spider web more than sheep's wool, or the airy threads that Indian women draw from the trees and weave into silk. The sea monster rose from below the sea, parting its surface directly in front of the girl. Most of him was hidden in the water, only his head emerged, but the dim outline of his body was drawn below the surface, as were the scaly laminations and sinuous laps of his neck, the spiny crest, and loops of tail. His jaws were long and large, opening wide from a point of intersection at the shoulders, and all the rest was gullet. Between the monster and the girl, Perseus was drawn descending from the air, in the direction of the beast. He was entirely naked but for a cloak thrown over his shoulders and winged sandals on his feet. A felt cap covered his head, representing Hades' helmet of invisibility. In his left hand he held the Gorgon's head, wielding it like a shield. Even as a painting it was a frightening object, with eyes starting out of their sockets, and serpentine hair about the temples all writhing and erect, a graphic delineation of intimidation. This was his left hand's weapon of war, his right was armed with a twin-bladed implement, a scythe and sword in one. The single hilt contains a blade that divides halfway along its extent. One part narrows to a straight tip, the other is curved, the one element begins and ends as a sword, the other is bent into a sinister sickle, so a single maneuver can produce both a deadly lunge and a lethal slash. This was Andromeda's drama. 13 Fulgentius from Mythologies, late 5th, early 6th centuries, translated by Leslie G. Whitbread. Terror and manliness. Although often identified with Saint Fulgentius, Bishop of Ruspa, the author of the Mythologies is probably a different writer. A Christian from North Africa, his writing, particularly his commentary on Virgil, was widely influential during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Medusa appears in his mythologies as a rich queen whose cunning gave her the reputation of having a snake-like head. Fulgentius also presents Medusa's tale as an allegory in which manliness, Perseus, and wisdom, Minerva, destroy the three types of terror embodied by the Gorgon sisters, Medusa being the terror imprinted upon both the mind and the face. The fable of Perseus and the Gorgons. They say that Perseus was the slayer of the Gorgon Medusa. They intended there to be three Gorgons, the first of them Stheno, the second, Euryale, the third, Medusa, and since their story has been written by Lucan and Ovid, poets perfectly well known in the first teaching stages taken with schoolmasters, I have considered it unnecessary to repeat the tale at length. Theocritus, the historian of antiquities, relates that there was a king Phorcys, who left his 3 daughters wealthy. Of these Medusa, who was the more forceful, increased her wealth by her rule and by cultivation and husbandry, whence she is called Gorgo, for Georgigo, for in Greek Georgi is the name for husbandman. She is also described as having a snake-like head because she was the more cunning. Perseus, coveting her rich domain, slew her. He is called winged because he came with ships, and carrying off her head, that is, her substance, he grew all the richer by securing her wide territories. Then, invading the kingdom of Atlas, he forced him to flee into a mountain, whence he is said to have been changed into a mountain, as it were, by the head of the Gorgo, that is, by her substance. But let me explain what the Greeks, inclined as they are to embroider, would signify by this finely spun fabrication. They intended 3 Gorgons, that is, the 3 kinds of terror. The first terror is indeed that which weakens the mind, the second, that which fills the mind with terror, the third, that which not only enforces its purpose upon the mind but also its gloom upon the face. From this notion the 3 Gorgons took their names. First, stheno, for steno is the Greek for weakening, whence we call asthenian sickness. Second, euryale, that is, broad extent, whence Homer said, Troy with its broad streets. Then Medusa, for Medusam because one cannot look upon her. Thus Perseus, with the help of Minerva, that is, manliness aided by wisdom, destroyed these terrors. He flew away with face averted because manliness never considers terror. He is also said to carry a mirror, because all terror is reflected not only in the heart but also in the outward appearance. From her blood Pegasus is said to have been born, shaped in the form of renown, whereby Pegasus is said to have wings, because fame is winged. Therefore also Tiberianus says, Pegasus neighing thus across the upper air. Then he is also described as having struck out a fountain for the Muses with his heel, because the Muses either follow their own method of describing the renown of heroes or indicate that of the ancients. The fable of Bellerophon. Then, too, Bellerophon, that is, good counsel, rides a horse which is none other than Pegasus, for Pegaseon, that is, an everlasting fountain. The wisdom of good counsel is an everlasting fountain. So, too, is Pegasus winged, because he looks down on the whole nature of the world with a swift perception of its designs. Then, too, he is said to have opened up the fountain of the Muses with his heel, for wisdom supplies the Muses with a fountain. He is born of the blood of the Gorgon because the Gorgon is explained as fear. She is attached to the heart of Minerva, as Homer says in his book 13, whereon is embossed the Gorgon fell of aspect, glaring terribly. Thus the interpretation can be one of 2 kinds, either wisdom is born when fear is ended, as Pegasus from death in the blood of the Gorgon, because folly is always fearful, or fear is the beginning of wisdom, because wisdom grows from fear of its master, and when anyone fears fame he grows wise. 14 John Malleus from the Chronicle, 6th century, translated by Elizabeth Jeffreys, Michael Jeffreys, and Roger Scott. The sorcery of Perseus, a Byzantine chronicler of Syrian origin, Malleus belongs to a tradition of popular historians influential in the codification of early Christian and, indeed, Western history. His Chronographia in 18 books is a compilation of history from the creation to about 565 CE and was written in the popular Greek of unlearned Christian circles. In this excerpt from Book 2, Medusa appears as a virginal country girl whose head Perseus cuts off rather mercilessly and transforms through loathsome sorcery into a weapon against his enemies. So Perseus was persuaded by his father Picus Zeus. Later, after the death of his father Picus and when he had become full-grown, he coveted the Assyrians' empire. He was jealous of the children of Minos his uncle, his father's brother. So, having consulted the oracle, he went off to the land of Libya. Along the road a country girl, a virgin, with wild hair and eyes met Perseus. He stopped and questioned her, saying, "What is your name?" She answered freely, "Medusa." Perseus grasped her by her hair and cut off her head with the sickle-shaped sword which he was carrying. Perseus took her head and immediately performed mysteries over it, as he had been instructed by his father Picus, in the deception of loathsome sorcery. He carried the head to help him against all his opponents and enemies, to subjugate and destroy them. He called the head Gorgon, quick, because of the swift way it helped and because of its effectiveness against enemies. Crossing over from there he came to the land of Ethiopia, over which Cepheus reigned. Finding there a temple of Poseidon, he entered and saw a girl, a virgin known as Andromeda, living in the temple. She had been dedicated in accordance with a vow of her father Cepheus. Perseus dragged her away from the temple, ravished her because of her beauty and made her his wife. As Perseus came to Isauria and Cilicia and met resistance from the enemy, he was given this oracle: when you dismount from your horse and place the sole of your foot, tarsos, on the ground, may you gain victory. So, getting down from his horse in the village known as Androsus, Perseus placed the sole of his foot there. Winning a victory by means of the Gorgon, he made the village into a city and called it Tarsos, from the oracle about his foot. He sacrificed an innocent girl named Parthenope to purify the city. After he had made his thanksgiving, he set out from there by way of Mount Argaios against the Assyrians. He defeated them and slew Sardanapalus, their emperor, who was descended from his own family. He subjugated the Assyrians and reigned over them for 53 years. He called them Persians after himself, depriving the Assyrians of both their empire and their name. He planted trees and called them Persia. He planted Persia not only there but also in the Egyptian lands in memory of himself. He taught the Persians to the rite of the loathsome and unholy Scyphos of Medusa, and because of this teaching he called their land the land of the Medes. After a time the emperor Cepheus, the father of Andromeda, attacked him from Ethiopia and made war on him. Because of his old age Cepheus was unable to see. When Perseus heard that Cepheus was making war on him, he was extremely angry. He marched out against him holding the Gorgon's head and showed it to him. Since Cepheus could not see, he charged at him on horseback. Then Perseus, unaware that Cepheus could not see, thought that the Gorgon's head which he was holding had lost its powers. So he turned the head towards himself and looked at it. He was blinded, stood motionless as if dead, and was killed. The son of Perseus and Andromeda reigned over the Persians, appointed by his grandfather, Cepheus, the emperor of Ethiopia. 15 Dante Alighieri from Inferno, c. 1310–1314, translated by Alan Mandelbaum. Virgil, Dante, and Medusa. A 14th-century Florentine poet. Dante's finest achievement is the great epic poem of Christian conversion, the Divine Comedy. In Canto 9 of the Inferno, Dante and Virgil approach the walls of the city of Dis, where their path is blocked. The Furies appear on the parapets, taunting them and claiming that Medusa is about to appear before them. John Freaksiro's essay, included later in this volume, discusses the implications of this moment. And Virgil said more, but I cannot remember because my eyes had wholly taken me to that high tower with the glowing summit where, at one single point, there suddenly stood 3 infernal furies flecked with blood, who had the limbs of women and their ways but wore, as girdles, snakes of deepest green. Small serpents and horned vipers formed their hairs, and these were used to bind their bestial temples. And he, who knew these handmaids well, they served the queen of never-ending lamentation, said, "Look at the ferocious Erinyes. That is Megara on the left, and she who weeps upon the right, that is Alecto, Tisiphon's between them." He was done. Each fury tore her breast with taloned nails, each, with her palms, beat on herself and wailed so loud that I, in fear, drew near the poet. "Just let Medusa come, then we shall turn him into stone," they all cried, looking down. "We should have punished Theseus' assault. Turn round and keep your eyes shut fast, for should the Gorgon show herself and you behold her, never again would you return above," my master said, and he himself turned me around and, not content with just my hands, used his as well to cover up my eyes. O you possessed of sturdy intellects, observe the teaching that is hidden here beneath the veil of verses so obscure. 16 Petrarch Rhyme Sparse, number 197, c. 1327–1374, translated by Robert M. Derling. Francesco Petrarca, or Petrarch, was an Italian poet and humanist, best known for his sequence of love poems devoted to a single beloved, Laura. In Sonnet 197, a poem in which he memorializes his first sight of Laura, he compares the instant of falling in love to being enraptured by Medusa, thereby likening the beauty of his beloved to the stunning powers of Medusa. Here, Petrarch also invokes the story of how Perseus turned Atlas into a stony mountain by showing him Medusa's head. In his use of Medusa as a figure for the power of Laura's beauty, Petrarch puns consistently on his own name. The Latin petrum means stone or rock. The heavenly breeze that breathes in that green laurel, where love smote Apollo in the side and on my neck placed a sweet yoke so that I restore my liberty only late, has the power over me that Medusa had over the old Moorish giant, when she turned him to flint, nor can I shake loose that lovely knot by which the sun is surpassed, not to say amber or gold, I mean the blonde locks and the curling snare that so softly bind tight my soul, which I arm with humility and nothing else. Her very shadow turns my heart to ice and tinges my face with white fear, but her eyes have the power to turn it to marble. 17 Colluccio Salutati from On the Labours of Hercules, c. 1381–1391, translated by Leslie Lundeen. Medusa as artful eloquence. The Chancellor of Florence from 1375 to 1406 and one of the most famous of the Florentine humanists, Colluccio Salutati allegorized the meaning of Medusa in this passage from the third book of his De Laboribus Hercules. Here, he offers an argument for the association of Medusa with artful eloquence. This association comes from a false etymology. The author reads the name of Medusa's father, forse, as a pun on the infinitive of the Latin to speak. Part of the Medusa effect is dazzlingly artful speech, striking the listener dumb. The relationship between Medusa and eloquence is discussed in Nancy Vickers's essay, excerpted later in this book. Moreover, Jupiter had Medusa's head on this shield, or, to be more accurate, he was believed to have it. This also, in my judgment, can signify rhetorical skill, and because of this I shall undertake a more in-depth explanation. A king Phorcys had 3 daughters of exceptional beauty, whose names were Euryale, Stheno, and Medusa. They say these girls possessed a single eye, which they each used in turn. However, Medusa alone had snakes for hair, the result of a tryst with Neptune in the temple of Minerva. Perseus, well protected by either a crystal or a bronze shield, killed her with a sickle-shaped sword and cut off her head, a head which used to instantly turn its viewers into stones. From her blood soon sprang Pegasus, the winged horse, who, by pawing up the ground with his foot, brought forth an underground spring, which is particularly sa cred to poets. And indeed, if one would fully understand this, one must go back to the end of the 4th book of Ovid's Metamorphoses, where the old tale is examined in detail. But as I was saying, Phorcys stands for rhetorical skill, since the name derives from for, ferus, the Latin to speak, or the Greek phoros, in Latin fair. Certainly, one's speech reveals one's aim. Yet the Greek ortion is the Latin ieramentum, which is spoken as a religious affirmation, for there is always something of this skill to speak powerfully in either a plain narrative or in a logical argument or when relying on a persuasive charm. In any case, his 3 daughters were as follows: Stheno, who, according to Fulgentius, represents weak prose, and which can be understood through grammar, because it can be learned at a tender age and because this capability still is in itself quite feeble, inasmuch as it may neither move nor prove nor persuade nor simply narrate. Euryale, to be sure, just as the same author, Fulgentius, proposes, represents extensive depth, which, in my opinion, is clearly logical, but he asserts that Medusa signifies oblivion, which is doubtless the art of oratory, an art which, by changing men's desires, erases their former thoughts. In this way, this last daughter is finer than the others, particularly with regards to the decoration of the hair, since it is in the rhetorical ornaments, which are represented by hair, and which is, as Apuleius shows, the special glory of women. And this is due to the fact that, if her hair should be removed, no woman would be so beautiful that she would not, in actual fact, appear most unsightly, and in the details of the argument, that rhetoric flourishes and that oratory itself is finer than the rest, seeing that, beyond grammatical agreement and proper signification and logical proof and the aim of persuasion, it adds ornament to one's words and sentences. Nevertheless, Neptune once lay with this Medusa in Minerva's temple. A wondrous secret lies hidden in this union. Note how just as when I previously argued about the unpraised Busiris, I once asserted that Neptune represents moisture. Natural eloquence derives its model from this, since eloquence resides in the voice, and no voice can become natural without moisture. Accordingly, Medusa is artful eloquence, Neptune the natural origin of that same eloquence, and Minerva the goddess of wisdom. Thus, every time the art and instruction of speaking are joined with natural eloquence in Minerva's temple, namely within that innermost place, the shrine of wisdom, then Medusa's locks are transformed into snakes. That is, the rhetorical ornaments become the heads and in fact the instruments of wisdom. And indeed, snakes can possess the figure of wisdom since this species of animals is reported to be the most cunning. However, before this particular union, Medusa could be seen without adverse consequences. From this fact comes the quote, "I discovered those who say they saw her." Yet, after nature had been joined together with art and wisdom, then, on account of a certain numbing admiration, the result transforms those observing it into stones, since those listening, just as if they had been terrified into paralysis, appear as stones. Or else they are so convinced of what they have been persuaded that they may be said to have acquired a stony quality. 18 Christine de Pizan from the Book of the City of Ladies, 1405, translated by Earl Geoffrey Richards. Medusa's beauty. Christine de Pizan, a French woman of letters born in Venice, was a writer of considerable skill. Both a poet and an historian, she authored a treatise on war and the only poem about Joan of Arc written during the latter's lifetime. De Pizan participated in the famous late medieval debate about women, the Querelle des Femmes, as a staunch defender of women. Her Book of the City of Ladies catalogues illustrious women and is considered an important early feminist tract. Similarly, Medusa, or Gorgon, was celebrated for her outstanding beauty. She was the daughter of the very wealthy King Phorcys, whose large kingdom was surrounded by the sea. This Medusa, according to the ancient stories, was of such striking beauty that not only did she surpass all other women, which was an amazing and supernatural thing, but she also attracted to herself, because of her pleasing appearance, her long and curly blonde hair spun like gold, along with her beautiful face and body, every mortal creature upon whom she looked, so that she seemed to make people immovable. For this reason the fable claimed that they had turned to stone. 19 Leone Ebrio from the Philosophy of Love, 1535, translated by F. Friedeberg Seeley and Jean H. Barnes. Allegorical meanings generally known to the Christian world and to historical scholarship as Leone Ebrio. Judah ben Isaac Abravanel was a Spanish Jew who fled Lisbon for Italy in 1492 with his father, the famous Jewish statesman and philosopher, Don Isaac Abravanel. Judah Abravanel exercised considerable influence on both Spanish mysticism and Italian Renaissance philosophy. He is most famous for his Dialogi d'amore, Dialogues of Love/Philosophy of Love, composed in the late 1490s and published posthumously in 1535. The participants of the Dialogi are two abstract entities, Philon and Sophia, who discuss the nature of love in great detail. In the following excerpt, Philon interprets the victory of Perseus over Medusa as a theological allegory for the ascent from earthliness and vice to spirituality and perfection. Perseus, son of Jupiter, according to a poetic tale, killed the Gorgon and, after his victory, flew away through the ether, which is the highest heaven. The historic meaning of this is that Perseus, called a son of Jupiter because of the share he had of jovial virtues, or else because he was descended from one of the kings of Crete, Athens, or Arcady, named Jupiter. Perseus killed Gorgo, an earthly tyrant, for Gorgo means earth in Greek, and was by men exalted to the skies for his virtues. Or again, morally Perseus signifies the prudent man, son of Jupiter, i.e. endowed with Jupiter's virtues, who, destroying the base and earthly vice symbolized by the Gorgon, ascended to the heaven of virtue. Then as for its allegoric meanings, first, it tells how the human mind, Jupiter's offspring, slaying and overcoming the earthiness of the Gorgonic nature, raised itself to understanding of the noble and eternal truths of heaven, in which speculation human perfection consists. This allegory is the natural one, because man is a natural being. But the tale also stands for another, heavenly allegory, to wit, that the celestial nature, child of Jupiter, having by its continual movement caused death and destruction among lower terrestrial bodies, this celestial nature, triumphant over corruptible things, detaching itself from their mortality, flew on high and remained immortal. Furthermore, the tale stands for a third, theological allegory, namely, that the angelic nature, which is the child of Jupiter, supreme god and creator of all things, destroying and putting from itself all corporeity and earthy materialness, symbolized by the Gorgon, rose to heaven, forasmuch as it is the intelligences separated from body and matter which forever move the heavenly spheres. 20 Giorgio Vasari from the life of Leonardo da Vinci, Florentine painter and sculptor, 1550, translated by George Bull. Leonardo paints the head of Medusa. Giorgio Vasari was a painter and architect of the Italian Renaissance, now best known for his design of the Uffizi Museum and for his book The Lives of the Most Excellent Architects, Painters and Sculptors, 1550 and, in a significantly enlarged and revised edition, 1568. This text was the first grand history of the visual arts in the Renaissance and defined the field for centuries afterwards. It remains important for the biographical detail Vasari offered as well as for his articulation of certain notions about art, the figure of the artist, and the periods defining rebirth of classical culture. The story goes that once when Piero da Vinci was at his house in the country, one of the peasants on his farm, who had made himself a buckler out of a fig tree that he had cut down, asked him as a favor to have it painted for him in Florence. Piero was very happy to do this, since the man was very adept at snaring birds and fishing, and Piero himself very often made use of him in these pursuits. He took the buckler to Florence, and without saying a word about whom it belonged to, he asked Leonardo to paint something on it. Some days later Leonardo examined the buckler, and, finding that it was warped, badly made, and clumsy, he straightened it in the fire and then gave it to a turner who, from the rough and clumsy thing that it was, made it smooth and even. Then, having given it a coat of gesso and prepared it in his own way, Leonardo started to think what he could paint on it so as to terrify anyone who saw it and produce the same effect as the head of Medusa. To do what he wanted, Leonardo carried into a room of his own, which no one ever entered except himself, a number of green and other kinds of lizards, crickets, serpents, butterflies, locusts, bats, and various strange creatures of this nature. From all these he took and assembled different parts to create a fearsome and horrible monster which emitted a poisonous breath and turned the air to fire. He depicted the creature emerging from the dark cleft of a rock, belching forth venom from its open throat, fire from its eyes and smoke from its nostrils in so macabre a fashion that the effect was altogether monstrous and horrible. Leonardo took so long over the work that the stench of the dead animals in his room became unbearable, although he himself failed to notice because of his great love of painting. By the time he had finished the painting, both the peasant and his father had stopped inquiring after it, but all the same he told his father that he could send for the buckler when convenient, since his work on it was completed. So one morning Piero went along to the room in order to get the buckler, knocked at the door, and was told by Leonardo to wait for a moment. Leonardo went back into the room, put the buckler on an easel in the light, and shaded the window. Then he asked Piero to come in and see it. When his eyes fell on it, Piero was completely taken by surprise and gave a sudden start, not realizing that he was looking at the buckler and that the form he saw was, in fact, painted on it. As he backed away, Leonardo checked him and said, "This work certainly serves its purpose. It has produced the right reaction, so now you can take it away." Piero thought the painting was indescribably marvelous and he was loud in praise of Leonardo's ingenuity. And then on the quiet he bought from a peddler another buckler, decorated with a heart pierced by a dart, and he gave this to the peasant, who remained grateful to him for the rest of his days. Later on Piero secretly sold Leonardo's buckler to some merchants in Florence for 100 ducats, and not long afterwards it came into the hands of the Duke of Milan, who paid those merchants 300 ducats for it. Leonardo then took it in mind to do a painting in oils showing the head of Medusa attired with a coil of serpents, the strangest and most extravagant invention imaginable. But this was a work that needed time, and so as with most of the things he did, it was never finished. 21 Natali Conti from Mythologies, 1551, translated by Anthony Di Matteo. Beauty and Pleasure. In the 10th book of his Mythologies, the Renaissance mythographer Natali Conti glosses the figure of Medusa, allegoriizing her to mean pleasures that entice and destroy man. Thus, she is made to stand as a moral lesson on the need for restraint. The image that emerges, that of the triumph of the rational over the uncontrollable, is later reinvoked in Sylvia Plath's poem Perseus, also included in this volume. Medusa. To demonstrate how constant we must remain in our confrontation with pleasures, the sages depicted Medusa as the most beautiful of women, on account of her appearance and charm that allured others, but all who saw her the ancients said were changed into stone by her, Minerva having given her this damnable power to make her odious to everyone after she had polluted Minerva's temple with Neptune, because all dedicated to pleasure belittle all reverence paid the gods and are accustomed to trampling under their feet all the rights of humanity and requisites of duty and become useless in all honorable things. Others thought that pride and arrogance were put down through this fable because Medusa had contended with the goddess over the beauty of her hair. Those who worry about such vain things belittle both men and gods. So did the ancients warn that lust, boldness, and arrogance must be restrained because God is the most exacting avenger of these flaws. For not only did Medusa lose her hair, Perseus through the counsel and support of the gods having been sent to destroy her utterly. The Gorgons. Because these are said to be two faculties or parts of our soul, one partaking of reason, the other without reason, that which is made up of reason were called the Graea, the elder born of the sisters, that is, wisdom, which is a necessity especially in difficult things and public affairs, but their younger sisters were the Gorgons, that is, the pleasures that entice and destroy men, from which Perseus could not have freed himself were it not for the help of the Graea. Because reason and lust are born from out of the same mind, lust must yield to reason, the cause why Perseus, or Prudence, is said to have conquered the Gorgons with an eye taken from the Graea and with the counsel and support of Pallas. Physically understood, the Gorgons are said to be the daughters of the waters of the sea, getting their name from the groaning and gargling sound the waves make. Perseus or the sun as an agent of the divine mind strives to find them and does so with the help of Minerva because all the acts of nature come about through divine wisdom since God and nature do nothing in vain. Due to the swiftness of the sun's movement, the ancients said Perseus wore the winged shoes of the nymphs because the sun penetrates all. Because the sun so extenuates the vapors that they cannot be seen, Perseus is said to have the helmet of Pluto and the sword of Mercury. Perseus slew Medusa, the only mortal among the Gorgons, since the sun draws up only the more refined or thinner part of the water which is created on the surface and which is susceptible to change. Since the wisdom of God is a marvel, and he has given the sun its strength, he who proves worthy by thought and mind to penetrate into the secret works of nature is thunderstruck when it comes to the rest of human affairs, nothing else concerning him a bit. 22 Vincenzo Carteri from Images of the Gods, 1556. Translated by Walter Hirschko. Imaging Medusa. Vincenzo Carteri, an Italian mythographer, describes the clothing appropriate to Minerva, Athena, in this excerpted section from his Images of the Gods. He argues that her mode of dress is taken from Africa and that the fringe of her aegis looks like little snakes and thus resembles Medusa's head. Regarding Minerva's tunic with the armor over it, Herodotus writes that the Greeks copied that mode of dress from African women who live around the Triton swamp, differing only in that the tunic which the African women wore underneath is made of animal hides and the hems or fringes of the vest worn over are not made of tiny serpents but of leather cut in small strips. The African women likewise also made the vest of leather from she-goat hide. For this reason, the Greeks called it aegida. Since ega in their language means she-goat. It is this aegida that we have called armor that had a fringe all around made of tiny serpents, as it appears that Herodotus meant when he wrote about the difference in dress between the African women and the attire of Minerva. The ancients often placed on Minerva's breastplate the image of the Gorgon, which was the head of Medusa crowned with a mane of serpents and sticking out her tongue. They also placed this image at times on her shield, which was called aegida as well, because Diodorus writes that Jove covered it with the skin of the she-goat named Amalthea, and then gave it to Minerva. But more frequently, with the term aegida one means the breastplate, which, as Hyginus writes, was not thus named due to ega or goatskin but from a daughter of the sun with this very same name that was, as is told in fables, of a marvelous whiteness with a stupendous splendor, but was nevertheless not pretty. In fact she was horrible to look at, and as soon as she showed herself to the Titans, enemies of Jove, they were all scared and stunned. Whereby the earth, beseeched by the Titans to take her away from their sight, hid her in Crete in a certain cave where she stayed until Jove removed her, when he wanted to have also the head of Medusa, because the oracle had said that without this he could not win against the Titans, as he subsequently did, and after the victory he gave the aegida, made from the skin of Ega with the head of Medusa to Minerva, who from then on always wore it. Virgil, when he writes that Vulcan puts the Cyclops to work to make Aeneas arms, as he had prayed Venus, and when he recounts what they were charged to produce, the thunderbolts of Jove, the chariot of Mars, and the armor of Minerva, who is similarly called Pallas, says of this last one, and with golden serpent scales they industriously made the tremendous Aegida, with which irate Pallas often arms herself, and to the breast of the goddess they affixed the truncated Gorgon's head who rolls her eyes with a menacing and wild glare. With the term Gorgon, however, one always means the head of Medusa, the sight alone of which could kill another, although Athenus writes that among the nomads of Libya there was a certain beast with this very same name that was similar to a ewe, or, according to others, similar to a calf. This creature possessed such awful breath that it could kill just with this alone all other beasts that came near to it. It could also kill with its gaze, when sometimes by shaking its head it would displace some hairs that would normally come down its forehead and cover its eyes. Some soldiers of Marius experienced this when he went against Jugurtha. While chasing that beast they fell down dead as soon as it looked at them. The inhabitants of the area told the nature of this beast to Marius, and they also killed it, since they knew how, lying in wait, one could kill it from afar. The skin was of such a variety of colors that when it was sent to Rome there was no one there who knew from which animal it came, and it was therefore placed in Hercules' temple to be marveled at. Proclus of Carthage writes, as Pausanias relates, that from the many and diverse animals that were in the African deserts there were also wild and beast-like men and women, and that he saw one of them brought to Rome, and he wanted to believe that Medusa was one of those women, who had gone to the Triton swamp and there had done evil to the inhabitants of that country until she was killed by Perseus with the help of Minerva, as she was a deity of that place. Diodorus writes that the Gorgons were bellicose women in Africa who were conquered by Perseus, who also killed Medusa, their queen, and this could have been part of history. But the fables relate, as one can read in Apollodorus' work, that the Gorgons were 3 sisters, of whom only Medusa could die. The other 2, who were named Euryale and Stheno, were immortal, and all of them had their heads covered with scaly serpents, and had teeth as large as a pig's, hands of copper, and wings of gold, with which they flew as they liked, and changed into stone whomever was seen by them. Perseus, having found them while they were sleeping, cut off Medusa's head and carried it away and gave it then to Minerva, who then helped him with this deed, since he had her shield, and from Mercury he had the scimitar and Talarix, the helmet of Arcus, that made one invisible, and a certain type of sack in which he carried the horrible head he received from some nymphs, who were shown to him by 3 other sisters of the Gorgons to get back the eye and the tooth which he had stolen from them. One reads that these sisters were born old and only had 1 eye and 1 tooth among them, and they took turns using them, now one, now the other. For this reason, as Pausanias writes, in the temple of Minerva in a certain part of Greece there was a statue of Perseus, to whom, as if he were going then to Africa to fight against Medusa, some nymphs were giving a helmet and were attaching Talarix to his feet. They also say, and this is the most common tale, that of the 3 beautiful sisters, called the Gorgons after certain islands of the same name, Medusa was the most becoming and had golden hair. Whereby Neptune became enamored of her and lay with her in the temple of Minerva, who in turn was offended and greatly angered, and therefore turned Medusa from beautiful and pleasant to look at, as she was at first, to something completely terrible and fearsome by changing her golden locks into ugly serpents. She wanted anyone who looked at Medusa turned into stone, but since the world could not tolerate such a strange monster, Perseus killed her with the help that I mentioned and gave the head to Minerva, who always carried it on her shield, or on the breastplate of her armor. 23 John Harrington, from his preface to the Orlando Furioso, 1591, Allegories of Man and Earth. John Harrington's 1591 translation of Ludovico Ariosto's chivalric epic Orlando Furioso into English heroical verse was the version best known to Elizabethan England. Ariosto, 1474–1533, an Italian poet, presented a Renaissance recasting of the adventures of Roland in this work. The account of Medusa found in Harrington's preface to his translation is typical of Renaissance allegorizations. Perseus, son of Jupiter, is feigned by the poets to have slain Gorgon, and after that conquest achieved to have flown up to heaven. The historical sense is this: Perseus, the son of Jupiter, by the participation of Jupiter's virtues that were in him, or rather calming of the stock of one of the kings of Crete or Athens so called, slew Gorgon a tyrant in that country. Gorgon in Greek signifieth earth, and was for his virtues parts exalted by men up into heaven. Morally it signifieth thus much: Perseus a wise man son of Jupiter, endued with virtue from above, slayeth sin and vice, a thing base and earthly signified by Gorgon, and so mounteth up to the skiae of virtue. It signifies in one kind of allegory thus much: the mind of man being gotten by God, and so the child of God, killing and vanquishing the earthliness of this gorgonical nature, ascendeth up to the understanding of heavenly things, of high things, of eternal things, in which contemplation consisteth the perfection of man. This is the natural allegory, because man, one of the chief works of nature. It hath also a more high and heavenly allegory, that the heavenly nature, daughter of Jupiter, procuring with her continual motion corruption and mortality in the inferior bodies, severed itself at last from these earthly bodies and flew up on high, and there remaineth for ever. It hath also another theological allegory, that the angelical nature, daughter of the Most High God the Creator of all things, killing and overcoming all bodily substance, signified by Gorgon, ascended into heaven. The like infinite allegories I could pike out of other poetical fictions, save that I would avoid tediousness. It sufficeth me therefore to note this, that the men of greatest learning and highest wit in the ancient times did of purpose conceal these deep mysteries of learning and, as it were, cover them with the veil of fables and verse for sundry causes. One cause was that they might not be rashly abused by profane wits in whom science is corrupted like good wine in a bad vessel. Another cause why they wrote in verse was conservation of the memory of their precepts, as we see yet the general rules almost of every art, not so much as husbandry, but they are oftener recited and better remembered in verse than in prose. Another and a principal cause of all is to be able with one kind of meat and one dish, as I may so call it, to feed divers tastes. 24 Francis Bacon Perseus, or War, from the Wisdom of the Ancients, 1609, translated by James Spedding. Tyranny and the Art of War, a major figure in the intellectual and political world of Jacobean England. Francis Bacon is celebrated for his works as a writer, scientist, philosopher, and statesman. This excerpt comes from De Sapientia Veterum, which he wrote in 1609, and which was first translated as The Wisdom of the Ancients in 1619. In his book, Bacon of Fers 31 political parables through readings of mythology. Thus, the encounter between Perseus and Medusa becomes an opportunity for Bacon to give advice on armed conflict with an enemy. Perseus was sent, it is said, by Pallas to cut off the head of Medusa, from whom many nations in the westernmost parts of Spain suffered grievous calamities, a monster so dreadful and horrible that the mere sight of her turned men into stone. She was one of the Gorgons, and the only one of them that was mortal, the others not being subject to change. By way of equipment for this so noble exploit, Perseus received arms and gifts from 3 several gods. Mercury gave him wings for his feet, Pluto gave him a helmet, Pallas a shield and a mirror. And yet though so well provided and equipped, he did not proceed against Medusa directly, but went out of his way to visit the Graea. These were half-sisters to the Gorgons, and had been born old women with white hair. They had but one eye and one tooth among them, and these they used to wear by turns, each putting them on as she went abroad, and putting them off again when she came back. This eye and tooth they now lent to Perseus. Whereupon, judging himself sufficiently equipped for the performance of his undertaking, he went against Medusa with all haste, flying. He found her asleep, but not daring to face her, in case she should wake, he looked back into Pallas's mirror, and taking aim by the reflection, cut off her head. From the blood which flowed out of the wound, there suddenly leaped forth a winged Pegasus. The severed head was fixed by Perseus in Pallas's shield, where it still retained its power of striking stiff, as if thunder or planet-stricken, all who looked on it. The fable seems to have been composed with reference to the art and judicious conduct of war. And first, for the kind of war to be chosen, it sets forth, as from the advice of Pallas, 3 sound and weighty precepts to guide the deliberation. The first is, not to take any great trouble for the subjugation of the neighboring nations. For the rule to be followed in the enlarging of a patrimony does not apply to the extension of an empire. In a private property, the vicinity of the estates to each other is of importance, but in extending an empire, occasion and facility of carrying the war through, and value of conquest, should be regarded instead of vicinity. We see that the Romans, while they had hardly penetrated westward beyond Liguria, had conquered and included in their empire eastern provinces as far off as Mount Taurus. And therefore Perseus, though he belonged to the east, did not decline a distant expedition to the uttermost parts of the west. The second is that there be a just and honorable cause of war, for this begets alacrity as well in the soldiers themselves, as in the people, from whom the supplies are to come. Also it opens the ways to alliances, and conciliates friends, and has a great many advantages. Now there is no cause of war more pious than the overthrow of a tyranny under which the people lies prostrate without spirit or vigor, as if turned to stone by the aspect of Medusa. Thirdly, it is wisely added that whereas there are 3 Gorgons, by whom are represented wars, Perseus chose the one that was mortal, that is, he chose such a war as might be finished and carried through, and did not engage in the pursuit of vast or infinite projects. The equipment of Perseus is of that kind which is everything in war, and almost ensures success, for he received swiftness from Mercury, secrecy of counsel from Pluto, and providence from Pallas. Nor is the circumstance that those wings of swiftness were for the heels and not for the shoulders without an allegorical meaning, and a very wise one. For it is not in the first attack, so much as in those that follow up and support the first, that swiftness is required, and there is no error more common in war than that of not pressing on the secondary and subsidiary actions with an activity answerable to the vigor of the beginnings. There is also an ingenious distinction implied in the images of the shield and the mirror, for the parable of Pluto's helmet which made men invisible needs no explanation, between the 2 kinds of foresight. For we must have not only that kind of foresight which acts as a shield, but that other kind likewise which enables us, like Pallas's mirror, to spy into the forces and movements and counsels of the enemy. But Perseus, however provided with forces and courage, stands yet in need of one thing more before the war be commenced, which is of the highest possible importance. He must go round to the Graea. These Graea are treasons, which are indeed war's sisters, yet not sisters German, but as it were of less noble birth. For wars are generous, treasons degenerate and base. They are prettily described, in allusion to the perpetual cares and trepidations of traitors, as old and white from their birth. Their power, before they break out into open revolt, lies either in the eye or the tooth, for all factions when alienated from the state, both play the spy and bite. And the eye and tooth are as it were common to them all, the eye because all their information is handed from one to another, and circulates through the whole party, the tooth, because they all bite with one mouth and all tell one tale, so that when you hear one you hear all. Therefore Perseus must make friends of those Graea, that they may lend him their eye and tooth, the eye for discovery of information, the tooth to sow rumors, raise envy, and stir the minds of the people. These matters being thus arranged and prepared, we come next to the carriage of the war itself. And here we see that Perseus finds Medusa asleep, for the undertaker of a war almost always, if he is wise, takes his enemy unprepared and in security. And now it is that Pallas's mirror is wanted. For there are many who before the hour of danger can look into the enemy's affairs sharply and attentively, but the chief use of the mirror is in the very instant of peril, that you may examine the manner of it without being confused by the fear of it, which is meant by the looking at it with eyes averted. The conclusion of the war is followed by 2 effects, first the birth and springing up of Pegasus, which obviously enough denotes fame, flying abroad and celebrating the victory. Secondly the carrying of Medusa's head upon the shield, for this is incomparably the best kind of safeguard. A single brilliant and memorable exploit, happily conducted and accomplished, paralyses all the enemy's movements, and mates malevolence itself. 25 William Drummond. The statue of Medusa, 1616, Lord of Hawthornden, near Edinburgh, where he was born and died. William Drummond was the first notable poet in Scotland to write deliberately in English. He was also the first to use the canzone, a medieval Italian or Provençal metrical form, in English verse. The statue of Medusa was written, however, in the form of an epigram, interesting in this context since many epigrams were originally composed to be carved on monuments. Here, Drummond meshes the 2 myths of Medusa and Narcissus to produce, in 8 lines, a poem of extraordinary power about self and image, masculine and feminine, art and life. Of that Medusa strange, who those that did her see in rocks did change, none image carved is this, Medusa's self it is, for whilst at heat of day, to quench her thirst she by this spring did stay, her curling snakes beholding in this glass, life did her leave, and thus transformed she was. 26 Johann Wolfgang von Goethe from Faust, 1808, translated by Stuart Atkins. Gretchen and Medusa. Goethe's centrality to German Romanticism is evidenced by the frequent reference to that period as the Age of Goethe. Poet, novelist, dramatist, critic, and scientist, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe was the early leader of the Sturm und Drang movement in German literature, culture, and politics, only to break with the movement and enjoy many years as a favorite of the court. Perhaps Goethe's best-known work, Faust, published in Germany in 1808 and 1832, reveals the futility of striving for absolute transcendence. In this scene, at a witch's mountaintop den, Faust imagines he sees Gretchen, the innocent young girl he plans to seduce. Mephistopheles' warning that the seeming beauty is only an apparition put forth by Medusa might serve as a larger caution to Faust as well. What he imagines he controls and enjoys will actually be the force that destroys him. This scene stresses the image of Medusa as a beautiful and seductive force against which men are weak. Mephisto, do you see off there, alone, dead pale, a lovely girl? Now she is slowly moving away, dragging her feet as if they were in fetters. I have to say I can't help thinking that she looks like my own dear Gretchen. Mephistopheles. Leave that alone, it only can do harm. It is a magic image, a phantom without life. It's dangerous to meet up with, its stare congeals a person's blood and almost turns him into stone. You've surely heard about Medusa. Faust. I know those are the eyes of someone dead, eyes that no loving hand has closed. That is the breast which Gretchen let me press, that the sweet body which gave me joy. Mephistopheles. Don't be so gullible, you fool. It's sorcery, to every man she looks like her he loves. Faust. What ecstasy, and yet what pain. I cannot bear to let this vision go. How strange that on that lovely neck there is as ornament a single scarlet thread no thicker than a knife. Mephistopheles. You're right, I see it too. She also can transport her head beneath her arm, thanks to the fact that Perseus lopped it off. I see you never lose your craving for illusions. 27 Percy Bysshe Shelley on the Medusa of Leonardo da Vinci in the Florentine Gallery, 1819, a poet and prose writer. Percy Bysshe Shelley was a central figure in British Romanticism. Joyous ecstasy and brooding despair are themes throughout his works. The narrator of On the Medusa of Leonardo da Vinci emphasizes the humanity lying beneath the amalgam of suffering and beauty that he sees on the face of Leonardo's Medusa. The poem was published posthumously by Mrs. Shelley in 1824. Words are missing in stanzas 3 and 5. For this image, see figure 14, no longer attributed to Leonardo da Vinci. It lieth, gazing on the midnight sky, upon the cloudy mountain peak supine, below, far lands are seen tremblingly, its horror and its beauty are divine. Upon its lips and eyelids seems to lie loveliness like a shadow, from which shine, fiery and lurid, struggling underneath, the agonies of anguish and of death. Yet it is less the horror than the grace which turns the gazer's spirit into stone, whereon the lineaments of that dead face are graven, till the characters be grown into itself, and thought no more can trace. 'Tis the melodious hue of beauty thrown athwart the darkness and the glare of pain, which humanize and harmonize the strain. And from its head as from one body grow, as grass out of a watery rock, hairs which are vipers, and they curl and flow and their long tangles in each other lock, and with unending involutions show their mailed radiance, as it were to mock the torture and the death within, and saw the solid air with many a ragged jaw. And, from a stone beside, a poisonous eft peeps idly into those Gorgonian eyes, whilst in the air a ghastly bat, bereft of sense, has flitted with a mad surprise out of the cave this hideous light had cleft, and he comes hastening like a moth that hies after a taper, and the midnight sky flares, a light more dread than obscurity. 'Tis the tempestuous loveliness of terror, for from the serpents gleams a brazen glare kindled by that inextricable error, which makes a thrilling vapour of the air become an ever-shifting mirror of all the beauty and the terror there. A woman's countenance, with serpent locks, gazing in death on heaven from those wet rocks. 28 Karl Marx from Capital, 1867, translated by Samuel Moore and Edward Aveling. The Medusa of capitalist production, perhaps best known as the primary author of the Manifesto of the Communist Party, 1848, Karl Marx has arguably had a more profound impact on modern ideology and political society than has any other thinker. Conceiving history as a series of class conflicts, Marx critiqued the capitalist system of production, which, he argued, exploited workers who become alienated from the products of their own labor. Through his analyses of ideology and commodity fetishism, Marx showed how capitalism effectively obscures for worker and capitalist alike the true nature of social relations. Here, in his preface to the first edition of Volume 1 of Capital, 1867, his seminal work on political economy, Medusa's head embodies the social evils that hide behind the veil of normalized capitalist production. Just as Perseus's magic cap shielded him from the monsters he hunted, Marx maintains that individuals now hide under their magic caps and pretend that the monsters of capitalism do not exist. The physicist either observes physical phenomena where they occur in their most typical form and most free from disturbing influence, or, wherever possible, he makes experiments under conditions that assure the occurrence of the phenomenon in its normality. In this work I have to examine the capitalist mode of production and the conditions of production and exchange corresponding to that mode. Up to the present time, their classic ground is England. That is the reason why England is used as the chief illustration in the development of my theoretical ideas. If, however, the German reader shrugs his shoulders at the condition of the English industrial and agricultural laborers, or in optimist fashion comforts himself with the thought that in Germany things are not nearly so bad, I must plainly tell him, de te fabula narrator. This story is about you. Intrinsically, it is not a question of the higher or lower degree of development of the social antagonisms that result from the natural laws of capitalist production. It is a question of these laws themselves, of these tendencies working with iron necessity towards inevitable results. The country that is more developed industrially only shows, to the less devil op-ed, the image of its own future. But apart from this, where capitalist production is fully naturalist among the Germans, for instance, in the factories proper, the condition of things is much worse than in England, because the counterpoise of the factory axe is wanting. In all other spheres, we, like all the rest of continental Western Europe, suffer not only from the development of capitalist production, but also from the incompleteness of that development. Alongside of modern evils, a whole series of inherited evils oppress us, arising from the passive survival of antiquated modes of production, with their inevitable train of social and political anachronisms. We suffer not only from the living, but from the dead. Le mort seisit levif. The dead man seizes the living one. The social statistics of Germany and the rest of continental Western Europe are, in comparison with those of England, wretchedly compiled. But they raise the veil just enough to let us catch a glimpse of the Medusa head behind it. We should be appalled at the state of things at home, if, as in England, our governments and parliaments appointed periodically commissions of inquiry into economic conditions, if these commissions were armed with the same plenary powers to get at the truth, if it was possible to find for this purpose men as competent, as free from partisanship and respect of persons as are the English factory inspectors, her medical reporters on public health, her commissioners of inquiry into the exploitation of women and children, into housing and food. Perseus wore a magic cap that the monsters he hunted down might not see him. We draw the magic cap down over eyes and ears as a make-believe that there are no monsters. 29 Dante Gabriel Rossetti Aspecta Medusa, 1870, born in Britain to a family of Italian exiles, Dante Gabriel Rossetti was highly educated and became known as a visual artist as well as a writer and translator. In 1848 he helped to found the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a group of artists seeking to revitalize theme and technique in British art. This selection evidences what Rossetti advocated as the interrelation of painting and poetry. The poem offers his commentary on his proposed painting of the same name. Both works focus on Andromeda's desire to see Medusa and Perseus's crafty fulfillment of that desire. Medusa here represents the forbidden thing that must be resisted, and the lesson to be learned is the importance of foregoing what we crave. For a drawing. Andromeda, by Perseus saved and wed, hankered each day to see the Gorgon's head, till o'er a fount he held it, bade her lean, and mirrored in the wave was safely seen that death she lived by. Let not thine eyes know any forbidden thing itself, although it once should save as well as kill, but be its shadow upon life enough for thee. 30 Friedrich Nietzsche from The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, translated by Walter Kaufmann. Medusa, Apollo, and Dionysus. A 19th-century German philosopher and writer, Friedrich Nietzsche is one of the most influential thinkers of the modern day. More a literary and social critic than a strict philosopher, Nietzsche contributed greatly to theories of art and aesthetics, affirming a dichotomy between what he called Apollonian and Dionysian art. The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1872, was Nietzsche's first book. In it he speaks of the tension between the Apollonian and Dionysian spirits. Early in his argument, Nietzsche invokes the Gorgon's head as a symbol of the Apollonian denial of the Dionysian spirit, the Gorgon's head interestingly guarding against the influences of Dionysian music and its orgiastic feeling, rather than being a force of seduction itself. From all quarters of the ancient world, to say nothing here of the modern, from Rome to Babylon, we can point to the existence of Dionysian festivals, types which bear, at best, the same relation to the Greek festivals which the bearded satyr, who borrowed his name and attributes from the goat, bears to Dionysus himself. In nearly every case these festivals centered in extravagant sexual licentiousness, whose waves overwhelmed all family life and its venerable traditions. The most savage natural instincts were unleashed, including even that horrible mixture of sensuality and cruelty which has always seemed to me to be the real witch's brew. For some time, however, the Greeks were apparently perfectly insulated and guarded against the feverish excitements of these festivals, though knowledge of them must have come to Greece on all the routes of land and sea, for the figure of Apollo, rising full of pride, held out the Gorgon's head to this grotesquely uncouth Dionysian power and really could not have countered any more dangerous force. It is in Doric art that this majestically rejecting attitude of Apollo is immortalized. 31 David Starr Jordan, The Head and the Snakes, 1899, a story for children. The leading ichthyologist of his day, David Starr Jordan, is perhaps best known as the first president of Leland Stanford Junior University, later known simply as Stanford. Prior to that, he had also served as president of Indiana University in Bloomington. The Head and the Snakes comes from a collection of stories, some original, some imitative, some travesties of the work of real storytellers, as he puts it, told to and later illustrated by children. Once there was a lady and she lived in a house all alone by herself, because her neighbors did not like her and she could not keep any servants. The trouble with her was that instead of hair she wore snakes, and her eyes turned everybody they looked on into stone, and whenever a tramp came along and knocked on the door and called for the lady of the house, she had only to look on him a moment and he turned into stone. She had in her backyard a whole pile of people leaned up against the fence, and every one of them had been turned into stone, because whenever she looked at anybody it turned him into stone. The neighbors got very tired of her, and so they told Perseus about it, and Perseus went off and borrowed a pair of wings that belonged to Quicksilver, and he fastened them on his feet. Then he went around to Venus and borrowed a nice new looking glass she had, and he took that in his left hand. Then he went out and got his big broadsword and took that in his right hand. Then he flew away with the wings to the house where Medusa lived, but he did not dare look at Medusa for fear she would turn him into stone, and he felt how ridiculous he would look turned into stone, with wings on his feet and a looking glass in his hand. So he walked on his toes backward up to the house and knocked with his hind foot on the door. Nobody came to the door, so he turned the knob and went in backward. Now it happened that Medusa was taking a nap on the lounge, and there wasn't a single serpent, by good chance, that was awake. So Perseus backed up to the lounge, holding the mirror before him, so that he could see where he was going, until he was opposite her. Then looking into the mirror he swung his sword over backward and cut Medusa's head right off, and then he grabbed it in his hand by the frizzes of snakes and went right out through the door without saying goodbye or anything, and flew away with the head in his hand. Then he did not know what to do with the head, and the blood dripped out of it and fell into the sand, and every drop that fell made a new snake, and the track over the desert of Libya where he went has been filled with snakes ever since, made out of that blood. Finally he car-ride the head around to where he saw a great big whale swimming after a girl that somebody had tied to a rock out by the sea, and the girl was crying and calling for her mother. So he just turned the face of Medusa on the whale and changed the whale into stone, and the whale lies there and has been stone ever since. But the girl he untied, and he showed her the way to go home. Still Perseus did not know how to get rid of the head. He never dared to look at it at all for fear it would turn him into stone. Finally, as he flew about on the wings of quicksilver, he saw old Jove taking a morning stroll through the skies, and he told Jove that he might have the head if he wanted it for his museum. And Jove was much pleased, for he liked all sorts of odd things, and he took it from Perseus and hung it up on one of the stars, and there it hangs yet, and if you go out any night and look up into the sky you will see that head way off and among the stars. There are 3 stars of them making a triangle away on the other side of the North Pole from the Big Dipper, and the star the head is fastened to is the one in the angle at the middle. And when the head was hung up its face was turned toward the earth and it changed the earth into stone, and that is why there is so much rock and stone on the earth now. And some say that the moon was changed to stone too. But I don't know about that, the moon looks too white to be stone. Anyhow, up in the sky the old head of Medusa is hanging yet, and if you go out at night you want to look at it over your right shoulder. 32 Louise Bogan Medusa, 1921, The New Yorker's poetry critic from 1931 to 1969. Louise Bogan held the chair of poetry at the Library of Congress and was awarded the Bollingen Prize in 1954. Medusa, first published in the New Republic in 1921, appears in an early volume of poems titled Body of This Death, 1923. I had come to the house, in a cave of trees, facing a sheer sky. Everything moved, a bell hung ready to strike, sun and reflection wheeled by. When the bare eyes were before me and the hissing hair, held up at a window, seen through a door. The stiff bald eyes, the serpents on the forehead formed in the air. This is a dead scene forever now. Nothing will ever stir. The end will never brighten it more than this, nor the rain blur. The water will always fall, and will not fall, and the tipped bell make no sound. The grass will always be growing for hay deep on the ground. And I shall stand here like a shadow under the great balanced day, my eyes on the yellow dust, that was lifting in the wind, and does not drift away. 33 Sigmund Freud Medusa's Head and From the Infantile Genital Organization, 1922 and 1923, translated by James Strachey. The classic psychoanalytic reading. Sigmund Freud was a Venus psychiatrist and the originator of psychoanalysis. Freud's prolific writings addressed the idea of the unconscious, the psychic region governing drives, emotion, and memory, as well as a wide variety of topics in literary, cultural, social, and sexual life. His writings on Medusa epitomize his ability to connect mythology and individual behavior to common psychic causes and functions. Medusa's Head, written in 1922 and published posthumously in 1940, ushered in a new wave of Medusaena. Both followers and critics responded, directly or indirectly, to Freud's suggestive reading of the myth. In this essay, the fear of castration as decapitation is explicitly linked to the fear of a horrific sight, the sight of the adult female genitals mitigated in the myth of Medusa by the presence of the phallic snakes and by the equation of petrification with male erection. Medusa's head. We have not often attempted to interpret individual mythological themes, but an interpretation suggests itself easily in the case of the horrifying decapitated head of Medusa. To decapitate equals to castrate. The terror of Medusa is thus a terror of castration that is linked to the sight of something. Numerous analyses have made us familiar with the occasion for this. It occurs when a boy, who has hitherto been unwilling to believe the threat of castration, catches sight of the female genitals, probably those of an adult, surrounded by hair, and essentially those of his mother. The hair upon Medusa's head is frequently represented in works of art in the form of snakes, and these once again are derived from the castration complex. It is a remarkable fact that, however frightening they may be in themselves, they nevertheless serve actually as a mitigation of the horror, for they replace the penis, the absence of which is the cause of the horror. This is a confirmation of the technical rule according to which a multiplication of penis symbols signifies castration. The sight of Medusa's head makes the spectator stiff with terror, turns him to stone. Observe that we have here once again the same origin from the castration complex and the same transformation of affect. For becoming stiff means an erection. Thus in the original situation it of fers consolation to the spectator, he is still in possession of a penis, and the stiffening reassures him of the fact. This symbol of horror is worn upon her dress by the virgin goddess Athene. And rightly so, for thus she becomes a woman who is unapproachable and repels all sexual desires since she displays the terrifying genitals of the mother. Since the Greeks were in the main strongly homosexual, it was inevitable that we should find among them a representation of woman as a being who frightens and repels because she is castrated. If Medusa's head takes the place of a representation of the female genitals, or rather if it isolates their horrifying effects from their pleasure-giving ones, it may be recalled that displaying the genitals is familiar in other connections as an apotropaic act. What arouses horror in oneself will produce the same effect upon the enemy against whom one is seeking to defend oneself. We read in Rabelais of how the devil took to flight when the woman showed him her vulva. The erect male organ also has an apotropaic effect, but thanks to another mechanism. To display the penis, or any of its surrogates, is to say, I am not afraid of you. I defy you. I have a penis. Here, then, is another way of intimidating the evil spirit. In order seriously to substantiate this interpretation, it would be necessary to investigate the origin of this isolated symbol of horror in Greek mythology as well as parallels to it in other mythologies. The infantile genital organization we know, too, to what a degree depreciation of women, horror of women, and a disposition to homosexuality are derived from the final conviction that women have no penis. Ferenczi, 1923, has recently, with complete justice, traced back the mythological symbol of horror Medusa's head to the impression of the female genitals devoid of a penis. 34 Sandor Ferenczi from On the Symbolism of the Head of Medusa, 1923, translated by Olive Edmonds. Medusa and castration. Trained as a neurologist and heavily influenced by Breuer and Freud's studies on hysteria, Sandor Ferenczi joined weekly meetings of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society in 1908 and remained one of Freud's closest friends and most frequent correspondents for many years. Ferenczi helped found and was president of the International Psychoanalytic Society and contributed significantly to innovations in analytic technique. This excerpt, from his further contributions to the theory and technique of psychoanalysis, was written after Freud wrote Medusa's Head but before that piece was published. It offers a concurring view that Medusa symbolizes the terrifying sight of the female genitalia. In the analysis of dreams and fancies, I have come repeatedly upon the circumstance that the head of Medusa is the terrible symbol of the female genital region, the details of which are displaced from below upwards. The many serpents which surround the head ought in representation by the opposite to signify the absence of a penis, and the phantom itself is the frightful impression made on the child by the penisless, castrated, genital. The fearful and alarming starting eyes of the Medusa head have also the secondary meaning of erection. 35 Count T. Cullen. Medusa, 1935. Count T. Cullen is most widely remembered as a poet of the Harlem Renaissance. Much of his literary contribution to that movement occurred while he was still quite young. Published in Cullen's 1935 volume The Medea and Some Poems, Medusa may be read as a meditation on ambivalence. Cullen's poems often use traditional verse forms. Medusa is a sonnet. I mind me how when first I looked at her a warning shudder in the blood cried, where? Those eyes are basilisks she gazes through, and those are snakes you take for strands of hair. But I was never one to be subdued by any fear of aught not reason bred, and so I mocked the ruddy word, and stood to meet the gold-envenomed dart instead. O vengeful warning, spiteful stream, a truce! What boots this constant crying in the wind, this ultimate indignity, abuse heaped on a tree of all its foliage thinned? Though blind, yet on these arid balls engraved I know it was a lovely face I braved. 36 Walter Benjamin from Paris, capital of the 19th century, 1939, translated by Howard Island and Kevin McLaughlin. Medusa and Modernity. A German literary critic of the early 20th century, Walter Benjamin wrote some of the most influential philosophical and social discourses of modern times. This excerpted passage, in which Benjamin imagines Medusa's gaze as a definition of modernity, is from his essay Paris, capital of the 19th century, written in 1939 for his monumental Arcades project. An earlier version of the essay, written in 1935, does not include the Medusa passage. The linchpin of Baudelaire's entire theory of art is modern beauty, and for him the proof of modernity seems to be this: it is marked with the fatality of being one day antiquity, and it reveals this to whoever witnesses its birth. Here we meet the quintessence of the unforeseen, which for Baudelaire is an inalienable quality of the 37. Philip Wylie from Generation of Vipers, 1942, Momism. Philip Wylie, a science fiction writer and screenwriter who produced both serious and popular works, defined momism for the American public in what he himself described as one of the most renowned, or notorious, passages in modern English letters. In 1942, spurred by what he saw as Americans' selfishness and moral impurities, Wylie expressed his views in Generation of Vipers, a book that, among other things, attacks American women as greedy, materialistic, and power-hungry faults embodied in the caricature of Mom. In this excerpt from the essay Common Women, the desexualized, hag-like Mom is first contrasted to, but then conflated with, the younger, sexually appealing woman, described by Wylie as both Cinderella and Medusa. Most decriers of matriarchy, however, are men of middle age, like me. Young men whose natures are attuned to a female image with more feelings than Mom possesses and different purposes from those of our synthetic archetype of Cinderella. The go-getter bounce anxiously away from their first few brutal contacts with modern young women, frightened to find their shining hair is vulcanized, their agate eyes are embedded in cement, and their ruby lips case hardened into pliers for bending males like wire. These young men, fresh startled by learning that she is a chrome-plated offreet, but not able to discern that the condition is Mom's unconscious preparation of somebody's sister for a place in the gynecocracy, are, again, presented with a soft and shimmering resting place, the bosom of Mom. Perseus was carefully not told that the Gorgons had blonde back hair and faces on the other side, like Janus, which, instead of turning him to stone, would have produced orgasms in him. Thus informed, he would have failed to slay Medusa and bring back her head. He might have been congealed, but he might not. Our young men are screened from a knowledge of this duality also, but they are told only about the blonde side. When they glimpse the other, and find their blood running cold and their limbs becoming like concrete, they carry off, instanter, to Mom. Consequently, no Gorgons are ever clearly seen, let alone slain, in our society. Mom dishes out her sweetness to all fugitives, and it turns them not to stone, but to slime. I give you Mom. I give you the destroying mother. I give you her justice from which we have never removed the eye bandage. I give you the angel and point to the sword in her hand. I give you death, the 100,000,000 deaths that are muttered under Yggdrasil's ash. I give you Medusa and Stheno and Uriel. I give you the harpies and the witches, and the fates. I give you the woman in pants, and the new religion, she popery. I give you Pandora. I give you Proserpine, the queen of hell. The 5 and 10 cent store Lilith, the mother of Cain, the black widow who is poisonous and eats her mate, and I designate at the bottom of your program the grand finale of all the soap operas, the mother of America's Cinderella. We must face the dynasty of the dames at once, deprive them of our pocketbooks when they waste the substance in them, and take back our dreams which, without the perfidious materialism of Mom, were shaping up a new and braver world. We must drive roads to Rio and to Moscow and stop spending all our strength in the manufacture of girdles. It is time that Mom's sag became known to the desperate public. We must plunge into our psyches and find out there, each for each, scientifically, about immortality and miracles. To do such deeds, we will first have to make the conquest of Momism, which grew up from male default. 38 Jean-Paul Sartre from Being and Nothingness, a phenomenological essay on ontology, 1943, translated by Hazel E. Barnes. The others look. A French novelist, playwright, philosopher, and cultural icon, Jean-Paul Sartre figures among the most renowned of modern intellectuals. He declined the Nobel Prize for Literature, for his autobiography, The Words, in 1964. This much discussed excerpt from his major work on existentialism, being, and nothingness, figures the look of Medusa as that which situates the otherwise transcendent for itself in a world of other things. It is only when the oppressed class by revolution or by a sudden increase of its power posits itself as they who look at in the face of members of the oppressing class, it is only then that the oppressors experience themselves as us. But this will be in fear and shame and as an us-object. As for the us-object, this is directly dependent on the third, i.e., on my being for others, and it is constituted on the foundation of my being outside for others. And as for the we subject, this is a psychological experience which supposes one way or another that the other's existence as such has been already revealed to us. It is therefore useless for human reality to seek to get out of this dilemma. One must either transcend the other or allow oneself to be transcended by him. The essence of the relations between consciousnesses is not the mitsane, it is conflict. At the end of this long description of the relations of the for itself with others, we have then achieved this certainty: the for itself is not only a being which arises as the nihilation of the in itself which it is and the internal negation of the in itself which it is not. This nihilating flight is entirely reapprehended by the in itself and fixed in itself as soon as the other appears. The for itself when alone transcends the world, it is the nothing by which there are things. The other by rising up confers on the for itself a being in itself in the midst of the world as a thing among things. This petrifaction in itself by the other's look is the profound meaning of the myth of Medusa. 39 James Merrill Medusa, 1946, James Merrill, a much-honored American poet, National Book Award, Pulitzer Prize, National Book Critics Circle Award, Bollingen Prize, is known both for his elegant, urbane lyric poems and for his epic trilogy, The Changing Light at Sandover, 1982. Medusa, published in his early volume The Black Swan, 1946, invokes images of both the Gorgon and Perseus through contemplation of a garden statue. The head, of course, had fallen to disrepair if not to disrepute. The bounteous days when the blank marble gaze was blind in its own right, did not need moss to mar its sightlessness. Brilliantly blind, the fabulous days are rare spiralings in the ear of time. The fountain mouth widens with bird droppings. The birds are south that whistled on the basin's rim, or circled delightfully where the white water sparkled. Snake-laurelled head with overturned eyeballs, the genius of our summer has become its monument, its tomb. We idle here under its massive spell where ferns, toothed yellow, tell how summer-long the makeshift waterfalls, birds, and their songs were false for being perishable. That face, now but a dry-lipped mask, babble no more of feet that fly and glass that looks in whose dream are rewound its peerless clocks? Birds foul a blind eye, that is how we dream. The face like Godhead in this world of sense had been a powerful lens of crystal once, perfection in its scope. But now leaves rasp and skip throughout the peeling empire. It would seem that nothing is the same. We might be studying the litter in our lives, in everything, and presently the word oblivion turns us to one another, as to stone. Our lives, yes, but emptied of our living. The blinding days have left no light in hand or hand's shade on the ground where, hand in hand, we harden, widen, grown silent and parched within, bewildered that there is no rainbow diving, no liveliness, no loving, not even the glad splatter making the face shine. If such trifles matter, once all is stone, that is, all but the snake's loud, lazy crown, the mouth that opens, speaks, the eyes whose suns of no return upon pure intellection glare, until it dims. Oh, maddened by such dreams, such features rolling in his head like eyes, tonight may one of us stride out into the coldest, roundest moon and strip his dreaming down to a cheap serpent horror too long reflected in a noble mirror of lust and birdsong, waterplay and guile, and raise his quivering sword, and think to kill. 40 Eric Newman from The Origins and History of Consciousness, 1949, translated by R. F. C. Hull. A Jungian view of the terrible mother. A German-born analytic psychologist, Eric Newman was heavily influenced by the archetypal theories of consciousness proposed by Carl Jung. In this passage from On the Origins and History of Consciousness, Newman associates the archetypal Gorgon figure with the castrating womb and with the lower, maternal aspects of the feminine persona. Among the symbols of the devouring chasm we must count the womb in its frightening aspect, the numinous heads of the Gorgon and the Medusa, the woman with beard and phallus, and the male-eating spider. The open womb is the devouring symbol of the Uroboric mother, especially when connected with phallic symbols. The gnashing mouth of the Medusa with its boar's tusks betrays these features most plainly, while the protruding tongue is obviously connected with the phallus. The snapping, i.e., castrating womb appears as the jaws of hell, and the serpents writhing round the Medusa's head are not personalistic pubic hairs but aggressive phallic elements characterizing the fearful aspect of the Uroboric womb. The spider can be classified among this group of symbols, not only because it devours the male after coitus, but because it symbolizes the female in general, who spreads nets for the unwary male. Now the Gorgons are the daughters of Phorcys, the Grey One, who, like his two sisters Keto, the monstrous, and Eurybia, the great in strength, and his brother Thaumas, the wonder maker, is a child of the deep, Pontos. All of them give birth to a terrifying and fabulous brood of monsters. The Gorgons, metallic-winged, serpent-haired and serpentine-girdled, tusked like boars, bearded and barbed, and with protruding tongues, are Euroboric symbols of what we might justly call the infernal feminine. Their sisters and guardians are the Graea, whose name means fear and dread. They too, with their one eye and one tooth between them, are Euroboric creatures who dwell on the uttermost confines of night and death, far to the westward, by the shores of the primeval ocean. Perseus has Hermes and Athene on his side, the tutelary deities of wisdom and consciousness, with whose help he outwits the Graea, contriving to learn from them the way to the nymphs. These beneficent sea goddesses give him the helmet of invisibility that belongs to Hades, a pair of winged sandals, and a wallet. Hermes presents him with a sword, and Athene lends him her brazen shield for a mirror, in which he can see the Medusa's head reflected and so is able to kill her, for to look directly upon the Gorgon's features is to risk certain death by being instantly turned to stone. We cannot enter more closely into this exceedingly interesting symbolism, except to say that intellect and spiritualization symbols play a most significant part. Flying, invisibility, and reflected sight form a homogeneous group, and to this we would add the wallet in which Perseus hides the Gorgon's head, thus making it invisible and harmless, as a symbol of repression. Now, what is so very odd is the manner in which Perseus is represented in early Greek art. The main feature is not, as one might think, the killing of the Gorgon, but the hero's headlong flight from the pursuing sisters. To our way of thinking it is strange indeed to see the valiant Perseus depicted over and over again as a tearing fugitive. Evidently the winged sandals, the helmet of invisibility, and the hiding wallet are much more important to him than the death-dealing sword, and his fear greatly enhances the horrific aspect of the slain but ever-pursuing Gorgon. Once more we encounter the mythological prototype of Orestes pursued by the Furies, for, like him, Perseus becomes a hero because he has killed the terrible mother. The Euroboric character of the Gorgon can be adduced not only from the symbols but also from the history of religion. In connection with the Gorgonesque sculpture on the Temple of Artemis in Corfu, dating from the 6th century, Woodward in Perseus, a study in Greek art and legend writes, it may seem odd that this uncouth, grimacing figure should be given the place of honor on the temple pediment, but the idea behind it takes us back to a time long before these Gorgon figures were identified with the creatures of the Perseus legend. With her attendant lions, she embodies the great nature spirit of primitive belief, who appears in early Asiatic and Ionian works of art as a goddess, with birds, lions, or snakes heraldically set on either side of her, the prototype of the Cybe of Phrygian worship and the Artemis of the Greeks. Here, through one aspect of her nature, she has become partly identified with Medusa. Without pausing to comment on this passage, we can take it that the identity of the Gorgon dispatched by Perseus, and the figure of the Great Mother who rules over wild animals, is proven, even for investigators not familiar with the real background of the myth. The hero's flight and escape, then, testify very clearly to the overpowering character of the Great Mother. Despite the assistance of Hermes and Athene, despite the miraculous gifts bestowed on him by the nymphs, and despite the fact that he averts his face for the death stroke, he is barely man enough to kill her. Note that the paralyzing and petrifying effect of the hideous death mask reappears as the stick-fast motif in the story of Theseus. Attempting to abduct Persephone from the underworld, he sticks fast to the rocks and is tormented by the Erinyes until Heracles comes to his rescue. The power of the Great Mother is too overwhelming for any consciousness to tackle direct. Only by indirect means, when reflected in Athene's mirror, can the Gorgon be destroyed. In other words, only with the help of the patron goddess of consciousness, who, as the daughter of Zeus, stands for heaven. On his way back from killing the mother, Perseus frees Andromeda from a horrible sea monster that ravages the land and is about to devour the girl. This monster has been sent by Poseidon, who is referred to as the Medusa's lover and is, as ruler of the ocean, himself the monster. He is the terrible father, and since he is the Medusa's lover, he is clearly related to the Great Mother as her invincible phallic consort. Again and again in his wrath he sends monsters to devastate the land and destroy the inhabitants. He is the dragon or bull who represents the destructive masculine side of the Ouroboros, which has split off and became Otonomous. The defeat of this monster is the task of the hero, whether he be called Bellerophon or Perseus, Theseus, or Heracles. Thus the sequence so typical of the hero myth is recapitulated in the story of Perseus. The killing of the transpersonal mother and father, the Medusa and the sea monster, precedes the rescue of the captive, Andromeda. His father a god and his mother the bride of a god, a personal father who hates him, then the killing of the transpersonal first parents, and finally the liberation of the captive. These are the stages that mark the progress of the hero. But this path can only be trodden to its triumphal conclusion with the help of the Divine Father, whose agent here is Hermes, and with the help of Athene, whose spiritual character and hostility to the Great Mother we have already emphasized. The fact that Perseus then gives the Gorgon's head to Athene, and that she emblazons it upon her shield, crowns this whole development as the victory of Athene over the Great Mother, of the warrior aspect which is favorable to man and consciousness, and which we also met in the Oresteia. The most striking feature in the figure of Athene is the defeat of the old mother goddess by the new, feminine, spiritual principle. Athene still has all the characteristics of the great Cretan goddess. On numerous vase paintings she is surrounded by snakes, indeed the great snake is her constant companion right to the end. Likewise her emblem, the tree, and her appearance in the form of a bird betray her Cretan origins. But the primordial power of the female has been subdued by her. She now wears the Gorgon's head as a trophy upon her shield. From quite early times she had been the patron goddess of the ruler and was worshipped in his palace, so that she came to symbolize the revolution which, in the patriarchal age, broke the power of the mother deity. Sprung from the head of Zeus, she is fatherborn and motherless in contrast to the motherborn, fatherless figures of ancient times, and in contrast, again, to the terrible mother's animosity toward all things masculine. She is the companion and helper of the masculine hero. 41 Sylvia Plath Perseus and Medusa, 1958 and 1962, Sylvia Plath, poet, story writer, and author of the novel The Bell Jar, wrote Perseus, The Triumph of Wit Over Suffering in 1958. Prompted by a drawing by Paul Klee, it was one of several poems inspired by works of art. In 1962, less than a year before her suicide, she wrote The Angry Medusa, which plays on the similarity between the Latin name for the jellyfish Medusa, Aurela, and Plath's mother's name, Aurelia. The eely tentacle of Medusa's hair becomes, in this poem, the Atlantic cable over which Plath and her mother had begun to speak on the telephone. Perseus, the triumph of wit over suffering head alone shows you in the prodigious act of digesting what centuries alone digest, the mammoth, lumbering statuary of sorrow, Indies soluble enough to riddle the guts of a whale with holes, and bleed him white into salt seas. Hercules had a simple time, rinsing those stables, a baby's tears would do it. But who'd volunteer to gulp the lacoon, the dying Gaul and those innumerable pietas festering on the dim walls of Europe's chapels, museums, and sepulchres? You who borrowed feathers for your feet, not lead, not nails, and a mirror to keep the snaky head in safe perspective, could outface the Gorgon grimace of human agony, a look to numb limbs, not a basilisk blink, nor a double whammy, but all the accumulated last grunts, groans, cries and heroic couplets concluding the million enacted tragedies on these blood-soaked boards, and every private twinge a hissing asp to petrify your eyes, and every village catastrophe a writhing length of cobra, and the decline of empires the thick coil of a vast anaconda. Imagine, the world fisted to a foetus head, ravined, seamed with suffering from conception upwards, and there you have it in hand. Grit in the eye or a sore thumb can make anyone wince, but the whole globe expressive of grief turns gods, like kings, to rocks. Those rocks, cleft and worn, themselves then grow ponderous and extend despair on earth's dark face. So might rigor mortis come to stiffen all creation, were it not for a bigger belly still than swallow's joy. You enter now, armed with feathers to tickle as well as fly, and a fun house mirror that turns the tragic muse to the beheaded head of a sullen doll, one braid, a bedraggled snake, hanging limp as the absurd mouth hangs in its lugubrious pout. Where are the classic limbs of stubborn Antigone? The red, royal robes of Phaedra? The tear-dazzled sorrows of Malphi's gentle duchess? Gone in the deep convulsion gripping your face, muscles and sinews bunched, victorious, as the cosmic laugh does away with the unstitching, plaguey wounds of an eternal sufferer. To you Perseus, the palm, and may you poise and repoise until time stop, the celestial balance which weighs our madness with our sanity. Medusa off that land spit of stony mouth plugs, eyes rolled by white sticks, ears cupping the sea's incoherences, you house your unnerving head god ball, lens of mercies, your stooges plying their wild cells in my keel's shadow, pushing by like hearts, red stigmata at the very center, riding the riptide to the nearest point of departure, dragging their Jesus hair. Did I escape, I wonder? My mind wins to you old barnacled umbilicus Atlantic cable, keeping itself, it seems, in a state of miraculous repair. In any case, you are always there, tremulous breath at the end of my line, curve of water upleaping to my water rod, dazzling and grateful, touching and sucking. I didn't call you. I didn't call you at all. Nevertheless you steamed to me over the sea, fat and red, a placenta paralysing the kicking lovers. Cobra light squeezing the breath from the blood bells of the fuchsia. I could draw no breath, dead and moneyless, overexposed, like an X-ray. Who do you think you are? A communion wafer? Blubbery Mary? I shall take no bite of your body, bottle in which I live, ghastly Vatican. I am sick to death of hot salt. Green as eunuchs, your wishes hiss at my sins. Off, eely tentacle. There is nothing between us. 42 Roger K. Lois from The Mask of Medusa, 1960, translated by George Ordish. The Gorgon Mask. A writer, editor, critic, cultural advocate, and sociologist, Roger K. Lois made significant and varied contributions to French thought. His Medusa et Company was first published in French in 1960 and translated into English as The Mask of Medusa in 1964. As part of his systematic effort to describe human mythologies of disguise and mimicry in aesthetic terms that parallel the terms of the natural world, K. Lois compares the penetrating power of the Medusa's gaze to that of a sacred mask and links this power to that used by insects. The story of Perseus and Medusa is quite transparent. It is merely an account of an initiation ceremony. The youth, given advice by his teachers and fitted out with all the necessary accoutrements, travels to the other world. That is, he goes into the bush, or to the surroundings where the sorcerer is to carry out the ceremony. He has to submit to the test and win through in order to become a man and have the right to wear the mask which will make him a member of the class of male adults or of a secret society. Not till then can he carry the disguise and paralyze his enemies with fright. The Gorgon's head is nothing more than a mask. It is not irrelevant to see in its intervention the belief in the evil eye, the hypnotising power of ocelli, clearly related to the wearing of masks in primitive communities, where often even the chance sight of a ceremonial mask by a non-initiate is a sacrilege bringing death, or at least the partial paralysis or the consumption of the bold or unfortunate person. And those in power will see to it that these expected results do indeed happen. At times they need do nothing, the thought alone will be sufficient. According to some, Perseus buried Medusa's head beneath the agora of Argos, but others have it that he offered it to Athene, who asked Hephaestus to place it on her shield. It is also said that Athene got the head as a prize of battle, or that Zeus, the only legitimate owner, lent it to Athene, and to other gods of sufficient rank, so that they might petrify their enemies. This fatal trophy is, like the eye, frequently found on shields. In classical times Athene carried it in the shape of a pectoral on the aegis. In fact the aegis is the double of the Gorgonian. It is the skin of the goat aegis, so fearsome that the sight of it made the bravest tremble. Even the Titans asked Gaia, its mother, to hide it. Consequently she shut it up in the grotto where Amalthea came to get its milk for the young Zeus. Later on Zeus used the skin to cover his shield. Another fable represents Aegis as an enormous monster who created the earth by his own means. His mouth spouted fire. He burnt up Phrygia entirely and the Caucasian forests as far as India. Athene killed him and used his skin as a breastplate. The aegis was not always a close-fitting breastplate made of scales on which shone the terrible head of Medusa. It could also be a large animal skin covering the torso at least as far as the loins. Put over the head, it hides the face and replaces it with the hideous mask of the Gorgon, with huge eyes, the tongue hanging between savage teeth and the hair a mass of writhing snakes. A painting from a piece of an Amasis vase leaves no doubt on this point and makes one think that originally the aegis was the complete disguise and the Gorgonian the mask. From the beginning, for instance in Homer's Iliad, this disguise and its accessory are at one and the same time offensive and defensive, spellbinding, paralysing, like the evil eye, like the ocelli of caterpillars, butterflies, and moths. Almost everywhere we see in man this tenacious, almost ineradicably, fear of the eye whose gaze paralyses, roots him to the spot, suddenly deprives him of thought, movement, and will. He is afraid of finding himself in front of this circular device, which can bring unconsciousness or death, which can kill or turn to stone. He is terrified by it, but at the same time tries to use this instrument of terror so as to be master of it in his turn. He invents fabulous creatures with the sole object of wringing from them this paralysing power, against which he feels defenseless, but which he hopes to take and use for his own ends. 43 Daryl Hine Tableau Vivant, 1968, Canadian-born Daryl Hine, a poet and translator, was editor of Poetry magazine from 1968 to 1978. Author of numerous volumes of poetry, he has translated the verse of Ovid, Homer, and Hesiod. In a 1972 essay on Medusa and romantic literary iconology, critic Jerome McGann describes Tableau Vivant as a brief allegory about what has happened to Western art between the 16th century and our own day. Hine's poem says to us, pictured here is the moment just before the hero Perseus will strike dead the monstrous offspring of Phorcys and Ceto. The artist knew only one way to tell the ancient story, but we now can see how equivocal it all might be, how much he is able to suggest of which he could not have been aware and would never have approved. Perseus on an ornamental charger, German work, 16th century, hovering above the slumbering Medusa like a buzzing fly or a mosquito on beaten, golden wings. His head averted from her agate gaze. In his right hand a sword, in his left a mirror. Helmeted by night, slipshod by darkness. Wondering where to strike. She looks asleep as if dreaming of petrified forests, monumental dryads, stone leaves, stone limbs, or of the mate that she will never meet who will look into her eyes and live. 44 May Sarton The Muse as Medusa, 1971. Although critical recognition arrived late for May Sarton, she acquired a large following over a career that stretched from her first book of poetry published in 1937 to her last collection in 1992. Her 1965 book Mrs. Stevens Hears the Mermaids Singing, in which Sarton came out as a lesbian, made her a feminist cult figure. In The Muse as Medusa, the speaker claims Medusa's frozen rage as her own, identifying it as a source of creativity and inspiration. I saw you once, Medusa, we were alone. I looked you straight in the cold eye, cold. I was not punished, was not turned to stone. How to believe the legends I am told? I came as naked as any little fish, prepared to be hooked, gutted, caught, but I saw you, Medusa, made my wish, and when I left you I was clothed in thought. Being allowed, perhaps, to swim my way through the great deep and on the rising tide, flashing wild streams, as free and rich as they, though you had power marshalled on your side. The fish escaped to many a magic reef, the fish explored many a dangerous sea. The fish, Medusa, did not come to grief, but swims still in a fluid mystery. Forget the image, your silence is my ocean, and even now it teems with life. You chose to abdicate by total lack of motion, but did it work, for nothing really froze? It is all fluid still, that world of feeling where thoughts, those fishes, silent, feed and rove, and, fluid, it is also full of healing, for love is healing, even rootless love. I turn your face around. It is my face. That frozen rage is what I must explore, O secret, self-enclosed, and ravaged place. This is the gift I thank Medusa for. 45 John Freaksero from Medusa the Letter and the Spirit, 1972, on Dante's Medusa. John Freaksero, author of Dante, The Poetics of Conversion, and numerous essays on topics in Italian literature, is one of America's foremost Dante scholars. Medusa, the Letter and the Spirit is an analysis of the figure of Medusa as it appears in both Dante's Rime Petrus and the Divine Comedy. Here, Freaksero argues that the thread posed by Medusa is first and foremost the thread of the beautiful Medusa, the thread of petrification based on erotic attraction. Several times in the course of his poem, Dante insists that his verses be read allegorically, but nowhere is his insistence more peremptory or more baffling than in Canto 9 of the Inferno, after Virgil covers the pilgrim's eyes to protect him from the sight of the Medusa. O voi avit li intelletti sani mirate la rina che es ascansato el velami deli versi strani. Inferno, 9, 61-63, O you who have sound understanding, see the doctrine that is hidden under the veil of the strange verses. These lines have always represented something of a scandal in the interpretation of Dante's allegory, primarily because they seem to fail in their didactic intent. In fact, the dottrina referred to here remains as veiled to us as it was to the poet's contemporaries. More than that, however, the dottrina, whatever it is, seems scarcely worth the effort. The verses suggest a personification allegory Medusa as moral abstraction very different from the theological allegory that, since the work of Charles Singleton, we have taken to be uniquely Dantesque. The allegory of the episode would seem to be no different from the allegory of poets, described in the Convivio as a mensigna lie hiding a moral truth, so that we are tempted to conclude either that Dante's allegory, though obscure, is no different from that of other poets, or that this first explicit reference to it in the poem is somehow atypical of the rest of the allegory. My purpose in this paper will be to suggest that neither of these alternatives is correct and that this passage, when properly understood, can provide us with a model for understanding Dante's allegory throughout the poem. I hope to show that the allegory is essentially theological and, far from being of purely antiquarian interest, a bizarre exegetical theory irrelevant to poetic practice, is actually indistinguishable from the poem's narrative structure. Christian allegory, I will argue, is identical with the phenomenology of confession, for both involve a comprehension of the self in history within a retrospective literary structure. Perhaps the principal difficulty with the address to the reader in the episode of the Medusa has arisen from our tendency to read it as though it were dramatically unrelated to its context, a generic recall to a moral code exterior to the text. In fact, however, this passage, like all of the addresses to the reader, is exterior to the fiction, but central to the text. The authorial voice is at once the creation of the journey and its creator, an alter Dante's other Dante who knows, but does not as yet exist, dialectically related to the pilgrim, who exists but does not as yet know. The addresses to the reader create the author as much as they create his audience, they are as the paradigm of the entire narrative, ensuring the presence of the goal at each step along the way. It is Dante's fiction that the author's existence precedes that of the poem, as though the experience had been concluded before the poem were begun. In reality, however, the experience of the pilgrim and the creation of the authorial voice take place at the same time, in the writing of the poem. The progress of the pilgrim and the addresses to the reader are dramatic representations of the dialectic that is the process of the poem. Journey's End, the vision of the incarnation, is at the same time the incarnation of the story, when pilgrim and author, being and knowing, become one. In precisely the same way that the pilgrim and the authorial voice are dialectically related to each other, the dramatic action involving the Medusa is related to the address to the reader immediately following it. This is suggested by a certain inverse symmetry. The covering of the pilgrim's eyes calls forth a command to uncover and see, mirate, the doctrine hidden beneath the verses, as if the command were consequent to the accession rather than simply the interruption that it is usually taken to be. As readers of the poem, we ordinarily assume that the dramatic action is stopped from time to time for an authorial gloss, as if the poet were arbitrarily intruding upon a rerun of his own past in order to guide us in our interpretation. Here, however, the symmetry between the action and the gloss suggests a more intimate, even necessary, relationship. The antithetical actions, covering/uncovering, suggest that we look for antithetical objects, Medusa/Rina, in two analogous or parallel realms, the progress of the pilgrim and the progress of the poem. The thread of the Medusa lends a certain moral force to the command to see beneath the strange verses, just as the address to the reader lends to the Medusa a certain hermeneutic resonance. It is because the pilgrim averted his eyes from the Medusa that there is a truth to be seen beneath the veil, because seeing it is a way of understanding a text. However, the implication seems to be that the Medusa is an interpretive as well as a moral threat. In other words, the aversion from the Medusa and the conversion to the text are related temporally, as the before and after of the same poetic event. Between those two moments, there extends the experience of the pilgrim, who has himself seen the doctrina and has returned as poet to reveal it to us. A passage in the Purgatorio lends considerable weight to our suggestion that petrification is an interpretive as well as a moral threat, and that the act of interpretation depends on a moral condition. At the end of the second cantica, on the occasion of Dante's own revelation, Beatrice chides him for his vana pensieri vain thoughts and for the delight he has taken in them. Io veggio tene lo intelletto fatto di pietra ed, impietrato, tinto si che tia baglia il lum del mio detto. Perg. XXXIII, 73-75. I see you turn to stone in your mind, and stone-like, such in hue that the light of my word dazes you. If we apply this imagery to the episode of Canto 9, then it is clear that petrification can mean the inability to see the light of truth in an interpretive glance. Thus, the threat of the Medusa may in a sense be a danger to be averted by the reader as well as the pilgrim. An intelletto sano, as Dante tells us in the Convivio, is a mind that is not obscured by ignorance or malizia malis, a mind that is not petrified. The dialectic of blindness and vision, aversion and conversion in the interpretation of the text, is central to biblical hermeneutics and is discussed by St. Paul with the figure of the veil. The use of the word velami in Dante's verses would seem to be an allusion to the Pauline tradition. To speak of a truth hidden beneath a veil was of course a banality in Dante's day, as it is in ours, but its familiarity derived from its biblical origin, where the veil was literally a covering for the radiant face of Moses and figuratively the relationship of the Old Testament to the New. Paul, in Corinthians, extends his discussion of the letter that kills and of the spirit that gives life by blending the words of Jeremiah about God writing his law in the hearts of his people with those of Ezekiel about the people of God having hearts of flesh instead of hearts of stone. In St. Paul's New Testament perspective, the hearts of stone become the inscribed tablets of the law of Moses, contrasted with the inscribed hearts of the faithful. He then discusses the meaning of the veil. Having therefore such hope, we show great boldness. We do not act as Moses did, who used to put a veil over his face that the Israelites might not observe the glory of his countenance, which was to pass away. But their minds were darkened, obtusi sunt sen sus eorum, for to this day, when the Old Testament is read to them, the self-same veil remains, not being lifted, non-revelatum, to disclose the Christ in whom it is made void. Yes, down to this very day, when Moses is read, the veil covers their hearts, but when they turn in repentance to God, the veil shall be taken away. Cum autem conversus fuerit ad dominum alferiter velamen. Paul here contrasts the letter of the Old Testament, written on tablets of stone, with the Spirit of the New, who is Christ, the unveiling, or revelation. The significance of the letter is in its final term, Christ, who was present all along, but revealed as the Spirit only at the end, the conversion of the Old Testament to the New. Understanding the truth is not then a question of critical intelligence applied here and there, but rather of a retrospective illumination by faith from the standpoint of the ending, a conversion. In the original Greek, the term used to describe the darkening of the minds of the Jews, pi omega rho omega sigma iota, petrification, is rendered in the Vulgate as obtusio dullness, but the sense of hardness remains alive in the exegetical tradition, where the condition is glossed as duriscia cordis, hardness of the heart. After the revelation, the inability to see beneath the veil is attributable to the God of this world, who strikes the unbeliever senseless. It is this God, which later tradition was to identify with the devil, that provides a generic biblical meaning for the Medusa, but if our gospel also is veiled, it is veiled only to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world has blinded their unbelieving minds, that they should not see the light, while we look not at the things that are seen, but at the things that are not seen. For the things that are seen are temporal, but the things that are not seen are eternal. The familiar dialectic of blindness and vision, as old as Sophocles, assumes a special poignancy in the life of Paul, who was at successive moments blind, first to the truth of Christ and then, on the road to Damascus, to the things of this world. Conversion is for him, much as it was for Plato, a turning away from the false light of temporal things, seen with the eyes of the body, to the light of eternity, seen with the eyes of the soul. Above all, blindness and vision are in the Pauline text metaphors for interpretation, the obtuse reading of faithless literalists transformed, by unveiling, into a reading of the same text in a new light. I should like to propose that the episode of the Medusa is an application of this dialectic to both the pilgrim and the reader. The before and the after of the conversion experience are rendered sequentially and dramatically by the threat to the pilgrim, on one hand, and the authorial voice, on the other. Between the aversion from a temporal threat and the conversion to the Christian truth, the rena, there is the Christ event in the experience of the pilgrim, the moment that marks the coming together of pilgrim and poet. From that ideal moment, Dante fulfills the role of a Virgil to the reader, sufficient to the task of averting his pupil's glance from the God of this world, the temptation of temporalia, yet not sufficient for the task of revelation. The threat to the pilgrim, petrification, seems to correspond to the various conditions of unbelief suggested by the Pauline text: blindness, hardness of heart, darkening of the mind, senselessness, while vision, presumably accomplished by the pilgrim/author and now proffered to the reader, corresponds to the eternity of things that are not seen. Literalists are blind to spiritual truth precisely because they see temporal things, while the things of this world are invisible to those who see the Spirit within. The Christ event in history, as described by St. Paul, is applied to the now of the pilgrim's journey in his meeting with Beatrice and is left as testament to the reader, who is exhorted to follow in his own way. En route, however, both must avert their glance from the God of this world. Whatever the merit of this dramatic outline, it still leaves us in the realm of poetic fiction. Several difficulties immediately present themselves which can be resolved only by exploring more deeply the relationship between the Pauline text and the verses of Canto 9. In the first place, the Pauline dialectic is built upon the fundamental opposition of two terms which are a unity in the Bible, the letter and the spirit, figuratively translated into visual terms by the opposition veil/face of Moses, Christ. Dante's use of the word velami also suggests a translation into visual terms of the interpretive act required of the reader at this point. What is not as yet clear is the sense in which the threat of the Medusa is in Dante's text, as petrification is in Paul's, the corresponding threat of the letter that kills. In other words, how is the face of Medusa the opposite of the face of Moses? Secondly, once the opposition between the threat of the Medusa and the rena is established, there remains the problem of their relationship, for letter and spirit, though opposed, are still one, as the Old Testament, written on tablets of stone or engraved on the stony hearts of unbelievers, is still one with its New Testament interpretation, written upon the fleshly tablets of the heart. The same is true of the figure of the veil. It is under the same veil, perceived by believers and unbelievers alike, that the truth is hidden. Paul attributes interpretive blindness to the God of this world, but in Dante's text it is the diabolic threat itself that must somehow lead beyond itself. In what sense might it be said that the threat of the Medusa masks a rena that is nowhere to be found on the printed page? The resolution of both of these difficulties will become clear when we decide which, precisely, are the versi strani referred to in the text. Our response must begin with some interpretive and historical remarks about the Medusa herself. To begin with, her story in antiquity seems a perfect counterpart to the story of the veiling of Moses' face. Dante was doubtless aware of the false etymology of her name concocted by the mythographers, mu eta iota delta sigma alpha upsilon, quod videre non possit, because one cannot look upon her. To see her was death. In order to protect himself from this threat, Perseus required the shield of Minerva, just as we, according to the allegorization of Albertus Magnus, require the shield of wisdom to protect us against delectationis concupiscentiae, the pleasures of desire. On the other hand, the face of Moses is a figure for the glory of Christ, illuminatio evangelii gloriae Christi, requiring nothing less than a conversion in order to be unveiled, revelatio. It remained for Dante to associate the two stories, recasting the Pauline dialectic of blindness and vision into the figure of the Medusa, corresponding to St. Paul's God of this world, and contrasting it with the admonition, immediately following, to gaze at the truth beneath the veil. The two stories serve as excellent dramatizations of the two moments of conversion, aversion from the self and the things of this world, conversion to God. Separating those two moments there extends the whole of the journey. A closer look at the tradition surrounding the Medusa suggests a more than dramatic aptness in the choice of this figure for the representation of a diabolic threat. The most startling thing about traditional efforts to discuss this episode is that they have missed what to a modern reader is most obvious. Whatever the horror the Medusa represents to the male imagination, it is in some sense a female horror. In mythology, the Medusa was said to be powerless against women, for it was her feminine beauty that constituted the mortal threat to her admirers. From the ancient physiologists through the mythographers to Boccaccio, the Medusa represented a sensual fascination, a pulchritudo so excessive that it turned men to stone. In Dante's text, there seems to be a survival of the theme of fascination, for it would be difficult to imagine why Virgil does not trust the pilgrim's ability to shield his own eyes if the image were not an entrapment. Fascination, in this context, suggests above all the sensual fascination celebrated in the literature of love. Whatever the significance of the Medusa motif to Freud and Ferenczi, we are dealing here with a highly self-conscious poetry and a kind of love poetry at that. It happens that there is an explicit reference in the text that helps to identify the subject matter as specifically erotic and literary, rather than abstractly moral. When the Furies scream out for the Medusa, they recall the assault of Theseus. Mal non vengemo in Teseo el assalto, poorly did we avenge the assault of Theseus, 954. This would seem to be an allusion to Theseus' descent into the underworld with his friend Pirithous, a disastrous enterprise from which he, unlike his hapless companion, was rescued by Hercules, but the point is that the descent had for its objective the abduction of Persephone. It was therefore an erotic, not to say sexual, assault. The presence of the theme here is not merely anecdotal. Dante is himself in a sense searching for a prelapsarian Persephone, an erotic innocence which he recaptures, at one remove, in his encounter with Matilda at the top of the mountain of Purgatory. Tu mi fai rimembrar dove qual era Proserpina nel tempo che perdet la madre lei ed ella primavera. You make me remember where and who Proserpina was when her mother lost her and she the spring. These two references to Persephone in the poem, the first implied and the second clearly stated, suggest that the figure of the Medusa is somehow coordinate to that of Matilda. Whatever else she may represent, the pastoral landscape and the erotic feelings of the pilgrim would seem to indicate the recapture, or near recapture, of a pastoral, and therefore poetic, innocence, a return to Eden after a long ascesis. For the moment, it might be argued that the Medusa represents precisely the impediment to such a recapture. Her association with Persephone goes back to the Odyssey, where Odysseus in the underworld fears that Persephone will send the Gorgon to prevent him from leaving. Whatever Dante's sources for making the same association, the point seems to be that short of Eden, there is no erotic or poetic innocence. The rhyme Petrus' stony rhymes, the dazzling virtuoso pieces of Dante's youth, celebrate a violent passion for the stony lady whose hardness turns the poet, her lover, into a man of stone. In the survey of the progress of Dante's love and of his poetry from the Vita Nuova New Life to the Commedia, the rhyme Petrus constitute a third element, radically fragmentary, Contini has called them, finding no place clearly identifiable in the poet's development. At one point in the Purgatorio, when Beatrice castigates the pilgrim for his infidelity, she accuses him of a love for Venita, a pargoletta, or little girl, using precisely the same word that the poet had used somewhat disparagingly of his Donna Pietra's stony lady in one of the rhyme. The recall in the Purgatorio of this word has given rise to endless speculation about the identity of the woman whom Dante denoted with the code name of Donna Pietra. Critics have been right, I think, to wish to see biography in the poem, but they have been incorrect to imagine that the words of the poem were simply vehicles for communicating true confessions. We have learned from Contini that the biography of a poet, as poet, is his poetry, and it is in a quite literal sense that the rhyme Petrus are present and relevant here. In the same poem that has given rise to speculation about the Pargoletta, there appear some verses of potentially greater significance. They describe a wintry scene in which the despairing lover seems to have lost his beloved forever. The description of a world without love, matching the poet's winter of the soul, contains exactly the rhyme words, alto, smalto, assalto, from Dante's description of the Medusa, sibilants that might qualify as versi strani in the address to the reader. Thus, in a passage which threatens petrification, is recalled, in a reified, concrete way, precisely the poem that described such a reification at the hands of a kind of Medusa. The words themselves reflect each other in such a way that they constitute a short circuit across the temporal distance that separates the two moments of poetic history, a block that threatens to make further progress impossible. For the reader, the parallel threat is to refuse to see the allegory through the letter, to ignore the double focus of the versi strani. The appearance of a recall to the rhyme pet rose is an invitation to the reader to measure the distance that separates the now of the poet from the then of his persona. In the fiction of the poem, the Medusa is, like the Lady of Stone, no historic character at all, but the poet's own creation. Its threat is the threat of idolatry. In terms of mythological exempla, petrification by the Medusa is the real consequence of Pygmalion's folly. There is some evidence that our suggested reading of the Medusa episode may have been anticipated by a near contemporary of the poet, or at least that the problematic was recognized and radically transformed by him. I refer of course to Petrarch, whose very name was for him an occasion for stony puns. In the course of his Canzoniera songbook, he provides us with a definitive gloss on Dante's Medusa. Like Pygmalion, Petrarch falls in love with his own creation and is in turn created by her. The pun Laura points to this self-contained process which is the essence of his creation. He creates with his poetry the Lady Laura, who in turn creates his reputation as poet laureate. She is therefore not a mediatrix, pointing beyond herself, but is rather enclosed within the confines of his own being as poet, which is to say, the poem. This is precisely what Petrarch acknowledges when he confesses in his final prayer to the sin of idolatry, adoration of the work of his own hands. Speaking of Laura no longer as the infinitely beloved, he calls her a Medusa. Medusa el error mio han fatto un sasso. Medusa and my error have made me a stone. For all of his tears of repentance, however, there seems to be a consolation for a more secular age. Petrarch's enduring fame as the weeping lover seems to suggest that, if he was turned to stone because of idolatry, at least a stone lasts forever. If it is devoid of the spirit linking it to reality and to the life of the poet, it is nevertheless immune to the ravages of time, a monumental portrait of the artist. In the same poem, he sees the problem of reification and idolatry as inherent in all poetry, including that of his illustrious predecessor. This, I take it, is the point of his address to the Virgin as the only true mediatrix and bringer of blessings, Vera Beatrice, where the absence of capitalization drives the point home more forcefully. For Petrarch, precursor of Romanticism, there can be no middle ground, not even that occupied by Dante. We are now in a position to answer some of the fundamental questions concerning Dante's allegory raised by the episode of the Medusa. Doubtless, the Pauline god of this world provides us with an appropriate and abstract moral meaning in the dramatization that might lead us to classify it as an example of the allegory of poets. At the same time, however, we have seen that the passage is charged with the temporality of the poet's own career, the Dante who is, looking back at the Dante who was, through the medium of words. This retrospective illumination is the very essence of biblical allegory, what Dante called the allegory of theologians. The Christ event was the end term of an historical process, the fullness of time, from the perspective of which the history of the world might be read and judged according to a meaning which perhaps even the participants in that history could not perceive. The then and now, the Old Testament and the New, were at once the continuity and discontinuity of universal history, the letter and the spirit respectively of God's revelation. Christian autobiography is the application of this diachronism to one's own life for the purpose of witness, confession, of the continual unfolding of the Word. Both confession and Christian allegory have their roots in the mystery of language. As language is unfolded along a syntagmatic axis, governed at each moment of its articulation by a paradigm present in the mind of the speaker and made manifest at the ending of the sentence, so the authorial voice in the text is as the paradigm of the entire narrative, of which the evolution of the pilgrim is, as it were, the syntax. When this dialectic is translated into dramatic terms that purport to be autobiographical, we are presented with a narrative which seems to demand both continuity and discontinuity, an organic continuity, so that it may make a claim to authenticity, yet with the definitive detachment of the author who makes a claim to finality. For the pilgrim and the author to be one and the same requires nothing short of death and resurrection, death, so that the story may be definitive and final, resurrection, so that it may be told. This narrative translation of the dialectic of language may in turn be translated into theological terms: conversion, the burial of the old man and the birth of the new, the essence of Pauline allegory. Christ, the ending of the story, is simply the manifestation of its subject, paradoxically present as the paradigm, the logos, from the beginning. The final manifestation of the paradigm is the presence of the logos made flesh. Just as history required an Archimedean point from which Christians could judge it to have been concluded, so the literature of confession would seem to require an Archimedean point outside of itself from which its truth can be measured, a point that is at once a beginning and an end, an alpha and an omega. Conversion was the name that Christians applied to such a moment in history and in the soul. In this sense, biblical allegory, conversion, and narrative all share the same linguistic nature. When St. Paul refers to the relationship of the Old Testament to the New, he is in fact applying this linguistic metaphor to the Christ event, the spirit inseparable from the letter of the Bible whereby it is made manifest. Without the letter, the spirit is the eternal logos, with no point of tangency to history, God's intentionality without relation to man. Without the spirit, the letter is utterly devoid of significance, as dead as the mute stones upon which it was written. God's utterance to man is the Word incarnate. Paul goes on to suggest that the Word of God interprets the hearts of men, the stony tablets turning to stone the hearts of unbelievers, while the Spirit writes upon the fleshly tablets of the faithful. So too, in Dante's text, it is the power of the letter to enthrall the beholder that makes of it a Medusa, an expression of desire that turns back to entrap its subject in an immobility which is the very opposite of the dynamism of language and of desire. To see beyond it, however, is to see in the spiritual sense, to transform the eros of the Medusa into the transcendent eros of Caritas. This is Dante's whole achievement as a love poet, a refusal of the poetics of reification, sensual and verbal, for the poetics of translation, as scribe of the spirit which is written on the fleshly tablets of the heart. I mi son unche, quando/amor mi spira, noto, e equal modo /che dita dentro, vio significando I am one who, when love inspires me, takes note, and goes setting it forth after the fashion which he dictates within me. The Book of Memory has as its author God himself. In this sense, Dante's poem is neither a copy nor an imitation of the Bible. It is the allegory of theologians in his own life. Nonetheless, the passage from the events of Dante's life to the words and images he uses to signify them is one that we cannot make. This is why it is impossible to guess at the identity of the Donna Pietra, just as it is impossible to see in the Medusa some event of the poet's life. We must be content with words on words, the double focus on a poetic expression, beyond which it would take an act of faith equal to Dante's to go, beyond which indeed, there is no Dante we can ever know. The address to the reader is thus not a stage direction, but an exhortation to conversion, a command to await the celestial messengers so that we, like the pilgrim, may trapasser dentro pass within. Beneath the veil of Moses, we behold the light of the gospel. Beneath the veil of Dante's verses, the Rena is derived from that, or it is nothing at all. 47 Hazel Barnes from The Look of the Gorgon, 1974, Sartre and the existentialist Medusa. Hazel Barnes, a professor of philosophy, is a noted Sartre scholar. In this excerpt from The Meddling Gods, she explores Sartre's reference to Medusa and postulates an existentialist interpretation of the myth. Near the end of his discussion of human relations in being and nothingness, Jean-Paul Sartre declares that the profound meaning of the myth of Medusa is the petrification of being for itself and being in itself by the other's look. At first reading we may fairly conclude that the fear of this kind of petrification is less pressing for at least half of the world's population than the dread of castration. If we strip away the technical language and consider Sartre's intended meaning, then I think we may find that in this one-sentence interpretation of a myth, there is a valid appeal to universal human experience and an appropriate recognition of what must have been the psychological factor behind the origin of the Gorgon. Instead of being for itself, read a human consciousness, for being in itself, read non-conscious being. Sartre is saying that when another person looks at me, his look may make me feel that I am an object, a thing in the midst of a world of things. If I feel that my free subjectivity has been paralyzed, this is as if I had been turned to stone, made like one of the lifeless statues in King Polydectes' court. Sartre's interpretation is as closely attached to his fundamental philosophical system, as inevitable for one closely acquainted with his work as Freud's association of Medusa and the idea of castration. In neither case should this fact be taken as rendering the interpretation suspect. Both men selected the image as expressing what seemed to them a self-evident truth about emotional experience. Sartre's view, if valid, has the advantage of applying to all of the human race, not solely to its favored half. It has, of course, its own difficulties. For Sartre, Medusa is the look, or at least one manifestation of it. The look is the revelation of the existence of the other. The illustration which Sartre uses, the famous keyhole passage, has by now become one of the great philosophical myths. Sartre asks us to imagine that we are looking through a keyhole watching intently what is going on inside. At this moment the persons before me are only objects of my consciousness, as completely so as the furniture or as the walls of the room which surround them. Everything refers back to me, the scene is an organized whole with me as center of awareness. I am a sovereign consciousness, pure subjectivity. I do not need to reflect upon myself, for all there is of me is engaged in the activity of spying. I am nothing but this activity. I am the subject to whom all objects appear. This is not a privileged moment of experience. This is my condition, my being, insofar as I am not forced by the other to reflect upon another dimension of myself. But now as I stand there absorbed in my spying, suddenly there are footsteps in the corridor. I straighten up to encounter the eyes which have already been looking at me as I was looking through the keyhole. There is a dramatic, a cataclysmic reversal. In acute shame and embarrassment I realize that I have been object to another subject. I am not solely a pure subjectivity. I am not only myself for me. I have a self for others. Sartre's claim that it is the look which reveals to me the existence of the other has inspired a hostile critic to paraphrase his position in the statement, "I am stared at, therefore you exist." If we were to insert the words "I realize" before "you exist," the parody would become a true summation. For Sartre, my realization of the other's existence as an independent subjectivity beyond my reach occurs simultaneously with my discovery that I, who am always and solely a free subject so long as I live non-reflectively, can be turned into an object for another and viewed from the outside. I may be seen as a hostile object, as disgusting, shameful, attractive, or admirable. The important point is that this judgment comes to me from without. I cannot control it. Nor can I know exactly what it is. The self which I am for the other is not the same as the self which I am for me. It is the only self which the other knows, and it is a self which I myself can never quite grasp. The other's look reveals to me that I am not alone in the world. This in itself might be reassuring. What turns it into a threat is my sudden perception that if I am not alone in the world, then the world is no longer my world. Worse yet, insofar as I have been in the habit of assigning to other people their place in the world of my mind and emotions, so I find that I am made part of the furnishings of the other's world. The look of the other, which reveals to me my object side, judges me, categorizes me, it identifies me with my external acts and appearances, with myself for others. It threatens, by ignoring my free subjectivity, to reduce me to the status of a thing in the world. In short, it reveals my physical and my psychic vulnerability, my fragility. The Medusa complex represents my extreme fear that by denying my own freely organized world with all of its connections and internal colorations, the other's look might reduce me permanently to a hard stone-like object. My most obvious recourse against this threat is precisely that of the Greeks. I don a menacing mask. I seek to stare the other down, to neutralize the hostile countenance with my own, to reduce him to an object before he can objectify me. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre's entire discussion of human relations is developed within the context of this subject-object conflict which the look initiates. We can observe how precisely the look is commensurate with the Medusa encounter. Neither my looking at an object nor my being looked at by a subject is sufficient by itself. The full experience of the look requires that I am aware of myself as being looked at. My eyes must encounter those of the Gorgon who looks at me. The question will be raised as to whether it is reasonable to assume that so sophisticated and contemporary an analysis could possibly be appropriate for the primitive period in which fear of the Gorgon stare and, Even earlier, the less differentiated concept of the evil eye originated. Or to put it more strongly, is not Sartre's interpretation based on an exaggerated sense of isolated and alienated individuality which perhaps fits 20th century experience but has nothing in common with the complex of ideas which gave rise to the story of Perseus and Medusa? To this objection I should reply that at least by the time of the Homeric Greeks, the sense of individualism is already very strong. For them the feeling of what one is depends primarily on the recognition which is bestowed by others, so much so that scholars have used the term shame culture to describe the prevailing pattern of interpersonal reactions. If I feel that I am as others view me, we have the requisite soil for nourishing a belief in the power of the eye of the other to do me harm. But I do not believe that the Gorgonian is exclusively linked with Homeric society any more than I think the experience described by Sartre is restricted to the 20th century. 48 Jacques Derrida from Glass, 1974, translated by John P. Levy, Jr., and Richard Rand. The Gorgon and the Jew. Jacques Derrida is an influential French philosopher and critical theorist who first articulated the style of reading called deconstruction. Glass, the monumental 1974 work from which the following piece is excerpted, has been variously called Derrida's chef d'oeuvre, Philosophies fleurs du mal, and a hypertext avant la lettre. It has also often been compared to Finnegan's Wake for its unreadability. In this passage, Derrida is reading Hegel's account of two founding Judaic moments, circumcision and the sacrifice of Isaac, in the spirit of Christianity, when he notices a passing analogy that Hegel makes between the Jew and the Gorgon. Taking this analogy placed between dashes in Hegel's text as a key interpretive locus, Derrida deploys the figure of Medusa to describe, among other things, the writing of a particular structure of power in a founding moment of Judaism. In the jealous God of Abraham and his posterity there lay the horrible demand that he alone and this nation be the only ones to have a God. Hegel writes, but when it was granted to his descendants to reduce the gap separating their actuality from their ideal, when they themselves were powerful enough to realize their idea of unity, then they exercised their mastery, herrschten, mercilessly with the most revolting and harshest tyranny, that utterly extirpated all life, for it is only over death that unity hovers. Thus the sons of Jacob avenged with satanic atrocity the outraging of their sister, even though the Shechemites had tried to make amends with unexampled generosity. Something alien had been mingled, gemis cht, with their family, had willed to fasten a bond, Verbindung, with them and so to disturb their segregation. Outside the infinite unity in which nothing but they, the favorites, Lieblingen, can share, everything is matter. The Gorgons had transformed everything to stone stuff, loveless, with no rights, something accursed which, as soon as they have power enough, they treat as accursed and then assign to its proper place if it attempts to raise anything, a finger, voice, protestation. Ist als Materie das Haupt der Gorgo verwandelt als in Stein, ein Leibund recht Loserstoff, ein Verflux, das den, sobald die Kraft des ist, auch so beendelt, ihm, das sich regen wollt, sein Stel und Schwiesen word. The head of Medusa, one of the three Gorgons, is between dashes. Like the Gorgon, the Jew materializes, petrifies everything he sees and everything that regards him, that raises, for example the eyes, toward him. An analogous accusation had been hurled against Socrates, and the analogy affords many readings. Hegel does not exploit further this small phrase between dashes. This phrase seems to effect, on the surface, a sort of conventional, illustrative, and pedagogical mythological recourse. Just that and nothing more. A Greek mytheme nevertheless seems to him pertinent for describing a figure of Judaism. One could ask oneself, in Hegel's terms or otherwise, about the general and pre-philosophical power of a mytheme born of a strongly determinate culture, which is opposed even, should the case arise, to that of Judaism. So Hegel makes the Gorgon upsurge and maintains her between dashes, as between parentheses or brackets. In the same way he had, in passing, situated circumcision and Isaac's sacrifice. An effect of the wide-open mouth. Convergence, the Jew affects, on himself a simulacrum of castration in order to mark his ownness, his properness, his property, his name, to found the law he will suffer in order to impose it on others and to constitute himself as the favorite slave of the infinite power. By first incising, entomant, his glands, he defends himself in advance against the infinite threat, castrates in his turn the enemy, elaborates a kind of apotropaic without measure. He exhibits his castration as an erection that defies the other. The logical paradox of the apotropaic, castrating oneself already, always already, in order to be able to castrate and repress the threat of cautration, renouncing life and mastery in order to secure them, putting into play by ruse, simulacrum, and violence just what one wants to preserve, losing in advance what one wants to erect, suspending what one raises, aufheben. The relief is indeed the apotropaic essence of life, life as apotrope. Now being is life, being is Aufhebung. The Medusa provides for no off-scene, or scene. She sees, shows only stony columns.